I've often said on this show that in my eyes there are three problems with India right now. The first of them is the proximate problem of the party in charge. Now, this is of course subjective and you can disagree with me on this. Now, here are the other two. These are deeper problems that have been with us for much longer. One is our fractured society, especially the way religion and history have been weaponized for narrow nationalistic purposes and the way Muslims have been othered. These strains have been with us for decades, but they found their most vociferous expression in these current times. In fact, the first problem is really a consequence of this second problem. Politics, after all, is supply responding to demand. But what I want to talk about today, what I want to talk about now is a third problem, the oppressive Indian state. I've been ranting about this for so long, more than 20 years in fact, that everything I now say will sound like my personal set of cliches. But I'll say it anyway. The Indian state is designed to rule us and not to serve us. We are effectively subjects and not citizens. All we did in 1947 is we replaced white-skinned rulers with brown-skinned ones. We kept the colonial apparatus of subjugating the people. We centralized power. And instead of protecting the people from the state, we protected the state from the people. This is normalized. Every political party that has held power has taken advantage of this. We can all agree that this is a problem. Where did it arise from? When I say our state is designed to rule us and not serve us, what do I mean by designed? What is this design? Well, this design is our constitution. Our constitution may have been framed with good intentions, but there is so much wrong with it. It does not protect our rights enough. Consider all the caveats on the right to free speech, for example. There is much about it that is illiberal and horrifying. Ambedkar himself was so disillusioned with it that in 1953 and again in 1954, he said he wanted to burn the Constitution. Now, one can find in the Constitution things we like and things we don't like. In a healthy discourse, we can talk about all of it. But in this present moment, criticism of the Constitution, which I've been doing for a couple of decades, has become associated with this government. And their critics are now treating the Constitution as some kind of holy book, which is just crazy. There is also the imputation that those who criticize the Constitution want a new Constitution. That's a lunatic suggestion. I shudder to think of what Constitution this regime would frame. But think about this for a moment. Why would they want a new constitution when this one enables them to rule India with impunity? Anyway, my broad point is that we need to keep talking about what ails our country. The design of the Indian state is one of those things. I'm going to keep talking about it.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Verma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen. My guest today is Arghya Sengupta, a brilliant lawyer who founded the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy about a decade ago. Now, I wrote a post on my newsletter last week about insiders and outsiders. I'm an outsider. Outsiders sit outside government and criticize it freely. They always speak truth to power. But they don't have any short-term impact on policy, even if they do tell themselves they're playing the long game. I'm the classic outsider. And then there are insiders who work within government or with government and try to bring about change in an incremental way. They don't criticize the government or other insiders as they know that is the best way to stay within the system and bring about short-term change. But even if they're driven by public purpose, they can be seen from the outside as being too close to government. Now, the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy does a lot of work for government and have been accused of being their stooges. I'll leave it to you to make that judgment, but I think the allegations are unfair and the truth is nuanced. Now, Arghya recently wrote a book called The Colonial Constitution. He's received a lot of flack for it, for people assuming he is advancing the government's alleged agenda against the constitution. People who say this haven't read the book. He's quite clear in the book that he is against making a new constitution. All he wants is discussion and debate. I agree with him, and I also argue with him. I ask the tough questions I want to ask. I state my disagreements with some of his points, but broadly, I found it an incredibly enlightening conversation. We started speaking about the book and the Constitution after the 2 hours mark. Until then, we discussed his journey, we discussed Vidhi, we chatted about what it is to work with government. The whole thing is fascinating. I think you'll enjoy it. But before you begin the conversation, let me inform you that after being super lax with my newsletter, I have burst into life. I've written 4 posts in the last few days, 3 of them in the last week, and I will be regular, quite as regular this year. That's my 2024 resolution. That's one of them. So head on over to my newsletter at indiauncut.substack.com and please subscribe. It's free. And now for a quick commercial break. Do you want to read more? I've put in a lot of work in recent years in building a reading habit. This means that I read more books, but I also read more long-form articles and essays. There's a world of knowledge available through the internet, but the problem we all face is, how do we navigate this knowledge? How do we know what to read? How do we put the right incentives in place? Well, I discovered one way. A couple of friends of mine run this awesome company called CTQ Compounds at ctqcompounds.com, which aims to help people up-level themselves by reading more. A few months ago, I signed up for one of their programs called The Daily Reader. Every day for 6 months, they sent me a long-form article to read. The subjects covered went from machine learning to mythology to mental models and marmalade. This helped me build a habit of reading. At the end of every day, I understood the world a little better than I did before. So if you want to build your reading habit, head on over to CTQ Compounds and check out their daily reader. New batches start every month. They also have a great program called Future Stack, which helps you stay up to date with ideas, skills, and mental models that will help you stay relevant in the future. Future Stack batches start every Saturday. What's more, you get a discount of a whopping 2,500 rupees. 2,500 if you use the discount code UNSEEN. So head on over to CTQ Compounds at ctqcompounds.com and use the code UNSEEN. Up-level yourself. Arghya, welcome to the Seen and the Unseen.
Thanks, Amit. Great to be here.
It's actually about time that you came here, because I've had so many episodes on just the Constitution, and that's kind of been a running trope on my show, like in larger ongoing discussion across 40, 50 episodes across 3-4 years. But before we go to that, and I really enjoyed your book, of course, but before we even get to that, I want to sort of talk a little bit about your life. And before we even get to that, I want to dig into what you were just saying, how CR Park Bengalis are not actual Bengalis. So can you elaborate on that?
They are actual Bengalis. It's just that the Bengali that is spoken here in CR Park is very different from the Bengali that we speak in Calcutta. And there are these CR Parkisms. That one of these is a very infamous Kanoki, which is a bastardized take on Kyoki. Because the CR Park Bengali has this innate ability to combine Hindi and Bengali and make the best or the worst of both. In Bengali, the word is because, which is karon in Bengali. But because in Hindi it's kyunki, it becomes kanoki, which seems quite intuitive in some sense, but is really jarring to the ear of someone who hasn't been here. But I've spent some of my best years in CR Park, so I'm not going to burn those bridges further. I think there are only some quirks in the way in which Bengali spoken, but the food is great, the fish is even better, and I'm a regular there, and I love every bit of it.
So, yesterday a friend of mine sent me this great saying, "Kos kos par badle pani, char kos par wani." So what is Bengali like in terms of dialects? Like you go outside Calcutta, you go to district parts, does the language change? And if the language changes, do you feel that, the change also reflects something fundamental about, the people there as well?
Yeah, I think that this is true with any language, that it's not spoken uniformly everywhere even in the same state. And it's certainly true for Bengal. My forefathers came from what is modern day Bangladesh. Three of them one was from Dhaka, one was from Faridpur, one was from Borishal, which are all sort of staple names in East Bengal. And my paternal grandmother was from Calcutta. So there was always used to be this feud in the house as to whether we are going to support East Bengal or Mohan Bagan. I was firmly on the East Bengal side of it, thanks to my mother. But the language that was spoken there, and I went to Dhaka quite recently and I had a chance to go back to the ancestral village where my great-grandfather had come from, because they had come actually even before the partition of Bengal, so it was a while back. But I did have a chance to see the school, and I had a chance to see, there were some writings on that he had left behind about a little pond in the village. So I saw all that. And the language that was spoken there was different, but somehow the same as well. And there were obviously certain words that were different. So we say in Calcutta, you'd say noon for salt. There you'd say lobon. And there was an interesting word, which is the word mojar. The word mojar just means funny in Bengali. But in Bangladesh, when you say mojar, it actually means great. So how's the food? Mojar. Which means that it's great. So there were these kind of quirks which were unique to the place itself. And it's not just Bangladesh. When I was in England, most of the Indian restaurants, as you will know, are run by Siletis. We got along because we spoke the same language, but only ostensibly so, because I could follow only about 40 to 50% of what was being said and tried to guess the rest, because we were usually talking about cricket, and so it was easy enough to guess the rest. But again, as there were significant differences, but I think that's really the way language is, because borders are transient, and borders are, well, actually they're a pretty new phenomenon. If you look at the Treaty of Westphalia, was what, 17th century, and the idea of borders is very much a 19th century idea, but there was free movement across, as always. So it's no surprise that in Sylhet, the language there, as it is, much more similar to what you'd hear in Bengalis in Tripura or in Meghalaya, in Chittagong, again, as it's closer to Burma. And whereas what you hear in Calcutta and so on is sort of its own animal. And that's why what you hear in Delhi in CR Park is a mixture of Hindi and Bengali. It doesn't make things, in my view, it doesn't make it any less legitimate. It just makes it different.
And one of the things I find so delightful is that being in India, we can hold these multiple identities. So you can have a really rich sense of being a Bengali or even a Bengali of a particular kind. Equally, you can have a rich sense of ownership as an Indian. You can have, a rich sense of belonging to whatever place you're actually born in, which may not be, Bengal. And you can be an individual, and that's kind of delightful. One thing I often envy when I hear people talk about their great grandparents and all of that is that I can't really trace my family history beyond my grandparents, right? And I love people who do. Like, I think Devanshu Datta was on the show, and he spoke about his 4 great grandfathers, I think, and one of them was a river pirate, and the others had colleges named after them. And it's kind of illustrious.
You have to take everything with a pinch of salt, but it made for a great story.
Even a pinch of noon. High noon. No, but I think his stories sound incredible, and then at some point you realize that they are actually true. So
that's true. No, I'm sure they are true. And no, I wish I actually knew more. We have records till my father's great grandfather, so that's 5 generations.
Wow.
But my wife's side, which is they're from Bombay, but originally from Junagadh. They have records actually going back a little bit further, so like 7 or 8 generations. Wow. And that's actually, I feel, really depends on who is a great documenter in the family. It needs that oddball in the family who kind of sits down and does this record keeping. And in Dhwani's family, as in her father, does that role. And someone must have done it in our time. It wasn't me or my father or my mother on her side. But yeah, we've got about 4 generations, and it's lovely and it was particularly lovely to go back to the village to somehow see where it all, what you think at least, began.
What did you feel?
It was interesting because to be perfectly honest, right at the beginning, I didn't feel anything except for the fact that it felt that I had come somewhere which had seen some members of my family. It's obviously not a place that my father or my grandfather had seen or been. So it's not as if I had any living memories. But what made the place come alive was actually the people. The people welcomed me as one of their own. Initially, there was this suspicion, because there is always, I was told this later, that there's always a suspicion that if there is someone coming from West Bengal who claims that they were from the village, there could be a property dispute. And I'm a lawyer, and so that really sets the alarm bells ringing. But I think once they got beyond that and they realized that this is not someone who's come back to take his ancestral land, I think there was a certain warmth. I mean, almost borderline aggressive warmth, which meant that I drank 4 cups of tea in 1.5 hours and had to have a meal, was taken around and given a guided tour of the village. I mean, I would say that it came close to feeling a sense of belonging for a place that was otherwise quite alien. In that sense. But again, the only connecting factor, if I were to go back to that time, was language. And I think that's what made me feel that though I was in a different country, and I needed a visa to go back to my ancestral home, that at least we didn't need a visa to connect with people who felt that they were exactly a kindred spirit in some sense. So it was a feeling that I haven't fully processed.
And I guess one sort of unseen way in which it might make a difference if you can trace your genealogy back, that then you also have some sense of family history, and that also gives you some sense of history of this nation itself, in the sense that we weren't always these lines on a map. It was something pretty different. It evolved over a period of time, and just having this sense that, oh, my great grandfather did this and my great great grandfather did this, could play a part in that. Whereas if you're born without that sense of, a history stretching decades back, you kind of may not have it. So tell me about your early childhood. Like, all of it was in Calcutta, I'm guessing. So take me through your childhood. What were your growing up years like?
Yeah, I'll just come to that in a second, because an interesting thing struck me, that when I was writing my ICSE exam, and I was seeing the languages that were available for examination, the first language on that list I still distinctly remember was AO.
Oh.
AO. Okay. And I actually didn't do any research at that point of time, and I still haven't done it. The thought just came back to me as you were saying it. And I felt at that time that I don't even know what this language is. I don't know who speaks it. I don't know. I mean, I have a vague sense that perhaps it's a language in the Northeast just because of the name, but I'm not really sure what this language is. But this is the first language that a board examination in India is available in. And I think that's the kind of feeling that I get, which encapsulates what this country is about. That this country is really, what you were saying, it's really about that diversity, where you start with Ao and end with Zo, and even in the language like Bengali, it's spoken in X number of dialects. And so the fact is that I think, as you were saying, that the idea of this nation has never been one of an homogeneous nation, and that is a very much a post-Westphalian European idea of a nation as a homogeneous unit of people speaking the same language, being of the same race, looking the same way. The idea of the Indian nation has never been really about that, and there has never been this homogeneity. We'll of course come to this when we are discussing the book. But my ICSE exam, and going back to my childhood, was in Calcutta. I had a very blissful childhood in Calcutta, and as a fellow Bengali, I think the best way to describe my childhood was that, you remember, there's this apocryphal saying that what's common between a Bengali boy and Jesus Christ.
What?
Do you know?
No, I don't.
Is that both of them think that their mother is a virgin, and both mothers think that their son is God.
Wow. Yeah.
And I think that actually captured very much what kind of childhood I had. It was a quintessential middle class Bengali childhood. I went to St. Xavier's School, which was a school my father had gone to and my mother taught in. I had a great time there. I hear of all these stories on your podcast as well, of army kids who've grown up all over. But I actually wouldn't trade my childhood for anything. It was a beautiful time. There was Christmas and New Year, walking around Park Street, biryani every week, at least 5 sweets after every meal. And of course, Durga Puja, which was our highlight of the year, where there was a license to stay up the whole night. It was a really blissful childhood. And one that I think I really hold on to, because the city is very different. I kind of have a insider outsider perspective, having not lived in the city now for over 20 years. So I see the city very differently than I did at that point of time. But those were, in that sense, some of the best years of my life. It was a blissful childhood, playing cricket on the streets when there were buns, of which there were many, which is why I have a very complicated relationship with the benefits or otherwise of communist rule, because having lived through it for the better part of my childhood, I saw how the theory and the practice worked together, or didn't, as the case may be. But at the same time, there was always this great plurality. There was a kind of blissful ignorance of divisions of class and caste, certainly of religion. And it was a good time to be in Calcutta. I had a very good childhood.
Just going back to the Ao language, I just find by quickly Googling it that it's a Naga language which is written in the Latin script. And of the 5 dialects which are mentioned, 2 of them are apparently, quote, nearly mutually unintelligible, which is, so it's fascinating. And it being in the Latin script indicates that essentially the British really came and figured out how to write it down and how to record it. And in the recording of something also, you run the danger of ossifying it and so many dangers. I'll double click again on sort of your childhood. You mentioned your mom was a teacher. I'm guessing that there would be books around the house, and Bengalis of a certain type generally like to have books around the house anyway. So tell me a bit about your parents. What were your mom and dad like? What was the texture of your early days in childhood? Were you reading a lot? What kind of kid were you?
Yeah, my mom was a teacher and my father was a banker, and both were avid readers, and I was an only child. So you can imagine what that household might have been like. I grew up with I grew up with a whole library full of books. And the interesting story, my mom, this was April 1990. And my mom had won a contest, one of these lucky draw contests, which I didn't know people could actually win, which is you get something at the bottom of a Pepsi can and stuff like that, which my mom won. And the prize was that Kapil Dev would come to your house. And Kapil Dev was at that time the biggest draw. And and it actually happened. It was a rainy day. I remember I could bunk school because it was this big occasion. And Kapil Dev was coming to our house, and the whole neighborhood had packed into our living room, which was small. So the living room could comfortably accommodate about 15, but there were about 150 people there in that living room. And our living room had this large bookshelf running through. And Kapil Dev came into the house and looked at the books and said, "Wow, so many books. Who reads them?" So, and we were like, "We all read them." So, like, "Wow, I must read some." And I was like, "Okay." It was a very interesting introduction to Kapil Dev, and so books have always been a very central element in the household. As wherever we found space, we managed to pack in some books. A lot of my initial reading was in English, though. Though it was a bilingual library. My father read a lot of Bengali himself. Was a great fan of Tagore, and but so I used to listen to a lot of Bengali, particularly music. But reading was primarily in English. So I guess like a kid of the late 80s and early 90s, you know, I guess after the kids' books, which I don't remember, but Enid Blyton. So started with Five Fine Outers and Famous Five. There was Billy Bunter, which my father had a few old copies of. There was William, and then it became Hardy Boys and Three Investigators. And then after that, moved on to Jeffrey Archer. I remember Cain and Abel was I felt like it was the single biggest achievement of my life, finishing Cain and Abel. And then, of course, I guess it goes on from there. So I think books form a very central part. Music forms a very central part of our growing up. There was a wide variety of music that was there, as keeping with the stereotype of Bengalis having a dark naam. As my father, unwittingly, of course, he didn't know what the ramifications of this was a big fan of Jim Reeves. And Jim Reeves had a song called Bimbo, Bimbo, Where You Gonna Go, You? So he decided that my dark naam would be Bimbo. So
Wow.
something that that at first was problematic, but then over a period of time, there was only one way to get through this, which was by owning it. So there was Jim Reeves, there were the Beatles, which my mother was a big fan of. There was a lot of Hindustani classical. There was a lot of eclecticism in our musical choices. There was a lot of Rabindra Sangeet, which I found right at the outset as the most deathly boring piece of music that I could, but over time realized my folly, because I realized that it's essentially about the lyrics. It's really, it's really not as much about the song. And though I was recently listening to, I was telling you before this conversation started, a podcast with Chandril Bhattacharya, who's a member of the Bengali band Chandrabindu. And he was saying that what makes a song what makes a song a hit song is really the tune and not so much the words. And he gave the example of the Beatles, and he said, "I want to hold your hand. I want to hold your hand." I mean, this is a song that any class 5 student could have written. There's nothing particularly spectacular about the lyrics, but it's a hit song because there is something about that, about the tune, the beat, that makes the song work. And I think that Rabindra Sangeet kind of flips this, because there are notable exceptions, but except for those exceptions, it's really very much about the lyrics. So it's not perhaps child friendly music, but there was a lot of it at that point of time. And so there was a range of music and books in the house. There was a lot of sport on TV at all points of time, so I was always allowed to see sport on TV. And I remember my father taking me. This was one of my earliest memories. The 1987 Cricket World Cup final was in Calcutta. I was 3 years old then, and my father got me in without a ticket. The policeman first protested, but then I was picked up on my shoulder and taken in to watch I think it was an Australia England game, that final. So there was always a lot of sport, and as I said, it was a the sport was more watched rather than played. Very amateur and terrible cricketer and footballer, but there was a genuine love for sport that was inculcated at that time. So yeah, it was a great childhood.
Sounds amazing, and I must commend your courage in revealing your nickname, because I too have a Bengali nickname which I will never reveal in public. Never. Like, you hold a gun to my head, I will say, press the trigger. I'm not doing it. Don't waste time, press it. So,
I was in that boat. I was in that boat for a while
my God, and then you
in
came to own
school,
it.
and I was like, no, I can't do this. It's fine. I'll live with it. And there was a I used to watch the NBA when cable TV had come, and there was a basketball player called Bimbo Cole.
Oh, that must have helped.
Yeah, and I was like, I mean, but I don't know why he had that name voluntarily, but given he did have that name, I was like, yeah, okay, you know what? I mean, that was one of the factors.
So, what kind of kid were you in terms of what did you want to do? Were you a daydreamer? If so, what kind of daydreams did you have?
I was bookish. I was bookish. I was an only child, and I spent in class 4. I got my class 4 or 5. I got a computer which was a 486. It was before Pentium, uh, and I used to fiddle around with MS DOS, trying to just work my way around what this magical thing is, and basically books were my vehicle into different worlds, which, because we at that point of time, as my father was working at the State Bank of India, so we used to wait for when he could take his LTC, and I think the furthest we went, we had a very I remember my first big holiday was one in when we came to Delhi to see the Delhi and Agra and Jaipur, the usual. And then I used to really look forward to our holidays. I always liked traveling, because I think that's what particularly reading Satyajit Ray, the Feluda Mysteries had created this wanderlust, this going to places which you have only heard of. And there was a non-Satyajit Ray book, but a beautiful book, which I don't know. I'm sure Arunava Sinha must have translated it by now. It's called Chader Pahad, which was a book by Bibhuti Bhushan, the person who wrote the book on which Pather Pachali is based, which was a really magical story about a young Bengali man who finds himself in Africa, and there is this monster and on the top of a mountain, and he has to go and find it. And that sense of mystery, I think, was inculcated, that I really wanted to travel. So, but of course, we never got to Africa. The furthest we went to was Rajasthan. I mean, this is very much sort of before the fruits of liberalization have come into the country. So I remember we had a long 25-day trip in Rajasthan, including Shonar Kella, which was the Golden Fort in Jaisalmer, which is every Bengali's dream to go to, where Bengali was spoken actually by the locals as well.
Wow.
Because at that point of time, actually, there were not that many tourists in Jaisalmer. Connectivity was hard. The roads were bad. You had to go about 6 or 7 hours from Bikaner, or about 5 or 6 hours from Jodhpur. So very few made that trek, except the hardiest of Bengalis in their monkey caps, of course, because they wanted to have a picture taken at Shonar Kella. So So at that time, as in, I was essentially a child who was a classic good kid, did well in school, studied hard, waited for my summer and winter holidays to go off somewhere, read books in my free time, fiddled around on my computer, and played cricket badly. I think that was basically sums it up.
So, what did you do after that? What were your college years like, and when did you come to sort of fructifying a sense of what am I going to do next? What am I going to be?
So I was a good public speaker in school. I did well in my extempore and debate competitions. So as with all good public speakers, my mother said you should think about doing law, and she said that in class seven. Uh, I wasn't clear what I wanted to do, except that I was clear, which was actually a big call at that time, that I wasn't going to do engineering or medicine. So, despite being a so called good student, I didn't take science in my 11th and 12th, which was a big call that surprised many of my teachers. But I was clear that I didn't want to do the sciences, and I was one of the only students or the only student who took humanities. It was a boys' school. St. Xavier's was a boys' school. It didn't offer humanities as a stream. We only had science and commerce, and but I took humanities because I felt that that's where my inclinations lay. I wasn't sure whether it was going to be economics or law. I did well at my boards. I thought I'd come to St. Stephen's and do economics. I did get in as well. But I had written the National Law School Bangalore examination. That time there were very few national law schools and the exams were separate. So I only wrote the National Law School examination, and I got in just about by the skin of my teeth. And then suddenly I was in this dilemma because I was pretty sure that I would go because my board results were good. I liked economics as a subject. I got St. Stephen's with hostel, which I was told was a very big deal, and so I was going to go there. But then I got NLS, and everyone said that you might as well think about this a little bit. NLS is a great school, um, and I thought about it a little bit, and not that it was particularly rational thought, but instinctively I felt that I'd find a home in the law. And my mother was convinced because I was a good public speaker that I should do it, and so I decided to go to NLS, which was the best decision in my life. I loved those 5 years in Bangalore. These were by far the best years of my life, and yeah, and I studied law, and I've had absolutely no regrets that I didn't do economics. And I think over time my affinity with numbers has reduced even further, or perhaps I never had any particular skill to begin with. So I feel that this choice was a good one.
So tell me about those 5 years were so great for you. Like at one level, I imagine that the kind of pedagogy you were exposed to was completely different. The way you were taught and all that would have been different. And two, was it also the case that the sort of rigor required in law and the systematic ways of thinking that you have to, start doing, did that fall in naturally with your inclinations and what you were good at?
I think for the first reason as to why it's great is more prosaic. Is that for the first time, I was outside home. And I was in a hostel. I had to fend for myself. Those hostel rooms were terrible. It was one room where three people had to kind of jostle for space, but it was kind of separated by three curtains. I'm trying to try and give you a graphic picture. And there was a cot. There was a metal table, a chair, and a little rickety wooden cupboard that was inside the wall. And it was essentially maybe 5 by 5, something. It was a kholi. So it was essentially a kind of reality check of some kind, and we had to do everything on our own. We had to fend for ourselves, for our own food. We had to figure out who our new friends would be. I was in a boys' school, so it was the first time that I was really talking to girls, and it was a new world, and I liked the trappings of this new world. I liked the freedom that it gave me. I liked the intensity of the academics. So I think it was the entire atmosphere around the classroom that first made me feel that, hey, this is something that I really like. Inside the classroom, I would say that the first trimester was really a continuation of school. I I didn't fully get the hang of it. Like in school, I got a sense that I have to do well. So it was a little bit like school where I felt like I was mugging up stuff and trying to be the best at what I can, trying to do the best that I can. But then I slowly got into it, and I think a great credit for that goes to our history teacher, Professor Elizabeth, who at that point of time I had a frosty relationship with. But irrespective of that, I give her great credit for opening our minds by asking the very simple question: what is history? Now, this is a question that I never thought of. I had never even dreamt that there would be a question of what is history? What is history? I don't know. I was looking for a definition from somewhere. But but it made us question some fundamental assumptions that we thought were dogmatic truths. And she was provocative. She was provocative, and it was an assault in some sense on all that we held dear. She said India was not a nation ever. It was never a nation. It's a constructed entity. It came into existence in 1947 as this mass, but there is nothing sacrosanct about it. It struck me as very problematic at that time. I mean, it was certainly making us question some very fundamental assumptions that made us really uncomfortable. And I think that's the first time that I realized what college education should be like, which is why I'm actually a big votary of ensuring that that law education in law not happen as a standalone stream. I do think that law should be a graduate degree wherever possible, because I think that 18 is too young, and I think you need a grounding in life and other disciplines before you get into the law. And also because from my own personal experience, the courses in social sciences for the first 2 years, I think really set a great foundation. So I think we need a little bit more of that and not less, because the prevailing sentiment in law school was, oh, we have to get by these courses before we get to the real stuff, which is contract law and constitutional law and so on and so forth. But I think that really opened our minds, and then came a course on constitutional law where we had a great professor, Professor Uday Raj Rai, to whom I owe a lot in terms of fostering this love for constitutional law. And and he asked some very fundamental questions in terms about uh, why do we need a constitution? What does it do for us? What does it do for us that politics can't? Why is it that people of a generation, in our case, those who lived between this 1947 to 50 period, decide for all future generations what this constitution is going to be like? What gives them the legitimacy to do that? These are all some very fundamental questions that were being asked, and questions that I didn't have an answer to, but certainly fueled a spirit of inquiry that I wanted to understand this more and to think for myself about this. So there was a heady intellectual atmosphere in the classroom, a great peer group, and I felt that, although some of my friends might disagree, that I was on my way to becoming a man.
Hmm. So tell me more about your intellectual evolution at this point, because I'm fascinated by the different ways in which your, Professor Elizabeth and your constitutional sort of law professor were asking all of these questions, which, make you go back to basics. So I'm curious about how your frame of looking at the world, how that developed through this period, because I imagine you come in with what is a relatively standard, simple way of looking at the world, but that becomes more and more nuanced and much sharper as you go through that. So, describe some of that evolution for me. What are the subjects that you started thinking deeply about? What are the TILs that you had during that period? How did you change your mind about stuff?
I think I started understanding India in that period. I think till then I was living in this bubble that was South Calcutta, and I thought that this is what India was. Maybe NLS was a slightly larger bubble. We were in Nagar Bhavi, which was that point of time a boondock in Bangalore. Now there's a huge ring road that runs through it. But we were of course very different in that sense from the town folk who were around, and there was a huge difference which made us always think that we were still in a bubble of some kind, but it was at least a very diverse and heterogeneous bubble with people from many different parts of the country. So I think for the first time, it made me think more deeply about the country that I call home. And at second, it made me comfortable about dealing with ambiguities. I think there was, as you said, a part of my childhood was marked very much by a quest for certitude. I mean, this is what I would say over time that this is what the problem of our school education system is, that everything has to be kind of in black and white and you have to answer in right or wrong and it's stuff like that. It doesn't prepare you for the world, which is actually full of shades of gray, right? So I think that there was this certitude that was perhaps a characteristic of my being when I was in school, which was completely punctured in college. And I realized that that was okay. That was okay because everything doesn't need to have a right answer. Everything doesn't need to always result in a definitive yes or a definitive no. And I think that's what was the biggest draw in college at that point of time. Uh, and I would say that as far as the law was concerned, I was still feeling my way around. I didn't develop any particular point of view while I was in law school. I think it was essentially being exposed to various facets of law, yes, but also various people and various parts of the country that I knew very little about. So, for example, one big, I wouldn't call it a revelation, but NLS was the first time that I had to deal openly with issues of caste. And this, of course, is a facet, as I realize, of the fact that I do come from a high caste background, and so it is not something that came up in my time in Calcutta. Caste wasn't a big issue in politics in Bengal at that point of time, so it was not as if I was reminded of my caste, whatever it might be. I knew what my caste was, but it was not as if I was reminded of my caste in every election. But this is where we really got into issues of caste. I read Ambedkar's Annihilation of Caste, and not only did I read it as a theoretical treatise, but it was very live in front of you because you're sitting in the same class with people who everybody knows has come in on with scheduled caste, scheduled tribe reservation. And there is always, in our political science class, I remember there was always this sense of, uneasy tension that existed in the classroom about these issues. And I had to think for myself. It was the first time that what I felt about it. And I think that I didn't have any easy answers at that point of time. There was no, we were reading it in both our political science classes and our constitutional law classes as issues of constitutional law. So we kind of foreclose that question slightly because then it becomes a kind of doctrinal question of what the Supreme Court said on subclassification between scheduled castes. So it becomes a kind of academic question. But I saw it in front of me. I mean, you didn't see it in any virulent fashion. Like it was very much. This is 2003 to 8, so it's not as if people didn't sit on the same table with someone they considered to be of a lower caste. It was not that kind of stuff that happened there. But there was this real uneasy tension, and there were these debates in class in terms of merit versus reservations, and the usual kinds of debates. But what my takeaway was that the answers were no longer simple. And I think that's something that I hold today. That one is that answers are not simple, and it's best not to judge somebody who has a different point of view, even if that point of view may not be well founded. And I think that was the biggest evolution in that period, that suddenly my world had been turned upside down from this world where everything was certain and right or wrong to a world where everything was shades of gray. And I was really trying to find a way to deal with it.
Because there are very few people who can deal with complexity, even in an environment like that, I'm guessing, it becomes really tempting to adopt a simplistic worldview and to make that the hammer with which you beat every nail. And therefore, what you can often find in our discourse is that you have a battle of vociferously argued, virulently argued, simplistic worldviews, and that recognition of complexity isn't there. And as the debate gets more and more polarized, I guess it's a danger that then, expressing any kind of complex view runs the risk of being cancelled by every side. What is sort of your sense of dealing with that? Like, how did you see that play out? Like, when you talk about how you gave up the quest for certitude while you were there because of the kind of pedagogy that was happening, because of the kind of questioning. Is that something that by and large you saw in all your classmates and colleagues, etc., etc.? Or is it that no, some of them found positions that were sort of attractive to them and stuck to those, and therefore, from their point of view, they could just claim a much greater virtue than someone who is otherwise accepting that there is complexity and therefore seems to be waffling?
Yeah, I think there were two factors there that were critical in NLS in the time at which I went. The first is that this was an age that was pre-social media. So there wasn't the posturing that is necessary today. So I think some of this urge for simplicity, for bite-sized pieces, to do away with nuance, comes from the fact that we want to have social media likes and we want to get all the retweets that we can. And so I think this was, not I think, I mean, it was before that time. And so people were okay with not necessarily having a strong point of view that would become the dominant narrative from now on in college. So I think that because it was pre-social media, it was not as if people wanted to have that one point of view and that one theory that explains everything. The second thing is also that we didn't have political parties on campus. And I think that also made a difference because it was not as if people were in camps. And these camps were ones that couldn't see eye to eye on some issues. So my friends who went to colleges in Calcutta, particularly the Presidency College, where many of my friends went, I mean, you could see that they fell into different camps and then you had to toe the party line. I think neither of this existed at that point of time. So I think that we were all, and I can't really speak on behalf of everybody, but we were all trying to find our way at that time. And it was a genuine quest of discovery in terms of what our own views are on particular issues, as to whether there is a right way of looking at some things. And of course, there were divisions of opinion. So I remember that at that point of time, there was the Narmada Bachao Andolan issue had come up in some shape or form, and Arundhati Roy had said something, had given a speech abroad somewhere talking about it, and I remember that there was a really spirited debate in class where there were people who completely castigated Roy for not saying what she did, but for saying what she did abroad.
Wow.
Okay, so like, don't wash our dirty linen in public, and while that struck me as strange at that point of time, you see that this is a kind of commonly held view that seems to dominate our politics today as well. That, there is this fear of the foreign hand of the other, that what you do here stays here, let's not do it abroad. And it's a kind of strange sentiment if you think about it. But it's a fact, and I think the person who was saying it was just channelizing that sentiment that clearly existed from wherever he or she came from. So there was a real diversity of points of view, but I think the key difference between them and what I see now, one is, as I said, is social media. So you get to see the real person, and as you were saying before, that people are much more polite in the real world than they are on social media, where they have a license to abuse. And I think the second thing was that I think a lot of these discussions were in good faith. Like, we could have this, and then we could go and have a filter coffee in the canteen together, irrespective of whether you agreed on this or not. So I think things didn't get personal, and so it was really formative. And if I were to really put a pin on it, I think it was formative because it, one, made me realize what country I lived in a little bit better. And two, because I learned, though this may sound paradoxical that it's a law school, but I learned not to judge. That people held different points of view and I feel that some of that carries through to the way I am today.
I want to double click on a question that you mentioned that, your history professor made you think about, which is about the notion that India as a state, as a nation state as we are now, these lines on a map, is relatively recent, 1947. Also, it is extremely contingent. You have all kinds of events and the lines on the map could be extremely different in various different directions. And this is just a small sort of sliver of history, and therefore then while our default sort of approach when we are growing up is this is my country and you're patriotic and all of that, I think where it shades into nuance over a period of time is that you begin to wonder, what am I really in service of in terms of my values? Am I in service of this country? Am I also in service of the people? Am I in service of the culture? Am I in service of a particular way of thinking that I would like to see more of, and etc etc. And you mentioned your friend saying that, oh, why did she speak abroad, which to me sounds completely ridiculous, because my loyalty to my country is, number one, it doesn't override my general sort of humanist sense, and number two, I think the loyalty to the country also involves this broader sense that to make this a better country, we have to keep criticizing it and keep examining it, and so on and so forth. Though I don't agree with Arundhati on most things, she has a right to do that wherever she kind of wants to. But just in terms of, this really fascinating and important question, which you mentioned came up over there, how have your thoughts on it evolved? Like, if I am to ask you, what are you in service of?
Yeah, so I think that the idea of a nation was always a problematic idea. And that's because, I mean, very early on, as you said, we all start with this notion that, we have to be patriotic and we sing the national anthem on 15th August. And all that is great. As in, you feel a heady sense of belonging. You're not exactly sure to what, but you do feel a heady sense of belonging. And it was interesting for me, but this idea of a nation was always a bit complex for me right at the outset, because this question was as to whether I should sing the national anthem in Bengali or in Sanskrit. This was a big question for me. Should I say Jana Gana Mana or should I say Jono Gono Mono? Okay, this was always a question, and I realized at some point of time that I could do both. So sometimes I did one, sometimes I did the other, and it really didn't matter. Because there was always this kind of Bengali identity which was sitting side by side with a larger Indian identity, which was sitting as part of a larger identity of being human. And a lot of that had to do with Tagore, not only because of the fact that he had written the national anthem, which when you read in Bengali, you will read as Jono Gono Mono. You will not read it as Jana Gana Mana, because that would be wrong. But when you read it in Devanagari, you will read it as Jana Gana Mana. So and this is the lens that I use for this really silly India Bharat debate that we've been having, right? I mean, it's India when we speak in English, it's Bharat when we speak in Bengali, it's Bharat when I speak in Hindi, Bharat when I speak in Bengali. So I don't think that this is necessarily an either or in any shape or form. So I don't think we need to manufacture these debates where none exists, particularly when it comes to language. Because when it comes to language, as in my view has always been, sorry, I'm digressing a little from your question, but my view has always been that actually diversity is what makes India what it is. And if there is the only way that India will be in trouble is if there is too much unification. This one nation, one language is actually going to be the death knell of this country if we do go down that line. So the idea of the nation was always a little bit problematic in terms of what you were in service of. And to be very honest, I don't have a easy answer to your question. I would say, as in having read a lot of Gandhi for the book and before, that I'm trying to be the best version of what I am, and I'm trying to find what I think would be a truthful argument. Right, and truth certainly knows no nationality. Truth knows no boundary, and the fact is that sometimes it may lead to an uncomfortable point of view. And we will come to the book later, but the book has caused some discomfort to people because any talk about changing a constitution at this point of time seems to be talk of or be conflated with calling for a constitutional Hindu Rashtra, which my book is not. But the fact is that it does cause some discomfort to people. But my abiding sense has always been to try and say something which I firmly and deeply believe in to be true. And of course, that's a point of view. And And whether there is a universal truth or not is a different question which we can get into if you want to spend 8 hours.
I want
But
to spend 8 hours.
yeah, no, I'm happy. I'm happy to get into that. But I think what that time in law school did was that it, one, as I said, made me feel that there isn't always a right answer. It's about the answer that I find and I believe to be true. And it's okay if that is not in black or white. Because usually answers that are in black or white are either the product of complete enlightenment, uh, Gautam Buddha, Prophet Muhammad, Jesus Christ type, or it is the product of complete ignorance. And with ordinary mortals like us, it will possibly be the latter and not the former.
Well said. Tell me also about how, through this period and after law school, how does your sense of purpose develop? Right? Because many people may not have a sense of purpose at all. It is not necessary to have a sense of purpose to live a life. In fact, you could say most people don't. You find what you're good at, you find how you can make a living, you find what makes you happy, you kind of go down those tracks. And that's perfectly fine. But equally, there can also be this sort of, as a background hum, this sense of this is who I am, this is what I believe in, etc., etc. So tell me a little bit about how that evolves and also how your journey after law school then evolves. Like, what do you really want to do? Because you've done law school, but there are so many options open to you at this point.
So I think and this actually segues from your last question quite well, because my sense of the nation develops actually when I'm not in the nation. When I'm in England, I go to England after NLS. I got a scholarship to go to Oxford, and I think I'm going to spend a couple of years, end up spending a good 5.5 years there, doing a master's and then an MPhil and then a DPhil, teaching for a couple of years. So I spent a long time there. And I think that's where my sense of what I want to do in life becomes a bit clearer. And it becomes clearer in two ways. One is that I'm clear then that I want to live only in India. I have a clear sense that, one, this is not my country. When I'm in England, that this is not my country. And this is not because there's some overt racist incident or anything like that. There are small acts of everyday racism that many people face, which I do as well. Not to say that that's the reason that I take this call, but I feel that law works in a particular cultural context, and it works a certain way depending on that cultural context. Let me give you an example. When we started National Law School, Bangalore, the first class that we take is Law of Torts. Okay. Now, the Law of Torts has this most famous case called Donahue versus Stevenson. Now, this is a case from 19th century England where a woman went to a pub and she ordered a bottle of ginger beer, found a snail in her ginger beer, and this became the defining case on the law of tort on negligence. That was, did the pub owner owe a duty of care to the customer to ensure that the drink was hygienic? And this went all the way up to the House of Lords and became so famous that 1.5 centuries later, halfway around the world, the first thing that a law student in Bangalore is learning of is Donahue versus Stevenson. And I wondered at that time that, if this happened in India, the woman would have thrown the snail and drunk the rest of the ginger beer, right? This happens all the time. Right. And the only reason it became a famous case is because it happened in England. It happened in a particular cultural environment where not only was this not acceptable and seemed to shock the conscience in some way that you wanted to go and file a case, but also something that was, captured some zeitgeist of the time, that it went all the way up to the House of Lords and became some defining case on negligence. And that made me realize that, these guys have built a perfect system for themselves. And it works there. As in, if you go to, I was there for 5 years in Oxford, and a lot of our universities are modeled on that college system. And the fact is that, and there is a lot to take away from that system. It's an extremely high quality of education, maintenance of institutional integrity, just beautiful city, beautiful buildings, and the rest of it. But I felt that it became clear to me that what we've been doing is trying to be an intelligently framed copy. And I felt that that was not going to work. And so that made my resolve on coming back even stronger. Uh, I mean, I used to facetiously say that we should all come back till the amount of money that is the equivalent of the Kohinoor diamond is repaid. So, but the fact of the matter is that I was pretty clear during my 5 years that I had a great time there. I really enjoyed myself there, and I owe Oxford a lot because I wouldn't have been able to, and I'll come to that later, wouldn't have been able to start Vidhi had it not been for my time in Oxford. But but it also made it very clear that this wasn't the place that I wanted to be in, and so I'm really grateful to it. I know a lot of people. I was listening to your podcast with Shubhashish, who was with me in Oxford a few years after me, and he said that it was the best years of his life, and it was quite life changing in some way. I think it was life changing for me too, but in a very different way, in terms of the fact that it made me realize very clearly that my sense of purpose, which is what you asked right at the outset, was to come back and try and find what a legal system and I'm borrowing from Gandhi here, that is, I quote, instinctive to India is. And I think that's what I think was the intellectual challenge for me. And yeah, and I came back because I found the weather terrible.
Yeah, we're sitting here in the cold of Delhi, and let me tell you, as a Bengali from Bombay, the weather here is not incredible.
It's not great. Yeah, it reminds me of Oxford as well. Yeah, but
A polluted Oxford.
hopefully a polluted Oxford, hopefully a passing phase. Yeah, but yeah, weather's not Delhi's strongest suit. So I think it's best, as Wittgenstein said, that what we cannot speak of, we should pass over in silence.
The famous last words of Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus.
Exactly.
So, here's what I'm going to ask you to do. I want you to educate me and my listeners really briefly on how laws evolve. Like, this is again one of those things I guess we normalize and take for granted that, there are laws, there are states, etc., etc. But how do laws actually evolve? What sort of laws should we have? Like, there is one notion that a society develops norms and conventions over a period of time and they harden into laws and etc., etc., and that is one way to live. And there is another notion that no, enlightened people from above can see the faults in society and, they can frame laws on how people should live. And, what Hayek might have called law versus legislation. How do laws evolve and how does it apply sort of in an Indian context? Because we've had invasions, we've had colonial rule, we've had sort of our constitution, which we can talk about later, but a lot of it seems to be this ongoing tension between a top-down imposition of certain rules and bottom-up norms and conventions, and you can make arguments for both sides. You can say that, look, a system of laws is only going to work if it is, if it arises from within the society. But equally, if there are huge problems within that society, huge illiberalism and sexism and whatever, then you might say that no, we know better, we've seen the world, we also have to control those sort of impulses. So, give me a sense of how you think about all of this.
I think of law like a club sandwich. I think it's layer on layer on layer, and then someone decides that there needs to be some ketchup that's thrown in the middle of layers 2 and 3. And so someone throws in that ketchup, and you can keep building that sandwich for as long as you want. And I think you're right on both counts that it builds over time. It builds from social conventions, it builds from customs that exist. If you ask this question in a particular historical context of India, as you said, as in this is going to be a real simplification of about 1,500 years, but essentially, what do we have? We have a range of customs, right? As in the range of customs are traditional practices that have been followed in small communities. There's never been this idea of this large state, and there are decrees that come from the Maharaja, as in which were either, it could be farmans of some kind, it could be other kinds of royal decrees that have come. But it's these two always kind of working in tandem. Partha Chatterjee has this excellent book, Nationalist Thought in a Colonial World, where he describes this very well, which is that, that in around the when the British come in, as in there is a move towards ensuring that change in society happens through legislation. Now, this is the first time that this kind of move happens when you're talking about sati and widow remarriage, where what you're looking at is essentially social customs which have operated in a certain way, which have not remained static. I think it's a mistake to think that everything remains static. Everything changes maybe glacially, but it changes. But now you want this kind of nuclear weapon, which is a legislation that can come in and can change it. So this is the first time that we have this idea of this binary, that there's legislation that is top down and the ketchup in that sense, and the layers of the sandwich interacting with each other. And both these processes continue, and you have examples of this in post-independent India. You have laws which are so-called progressive, enlightened. So the Hindu Code Bill is a good example where obviously the Hindu religion does not want to be limited in terms of number of times that a man can marry, and a whole range of other reforms. But the first parliament led by Nehru is insistent that we pass the Hindu Code Bill, which completely reforms and codifies Hindu personal law relating to marriage, divorce, adoption, guardianship, and inheritance. And then there are laws that develop over a passage of time because they reflect what we think is where society has currently reached. And of course, you could take laws in relation to, say, the Epidemic Diseases Act. The Epidemic Diseases Act was passed by the British in 1897 because epidemics had become a real thing. The state needed, and this was in the aftermath of the Bombay plague, where the state needed wide powers in order to control these epidemics. So it's a very short 3-section legislation which essentially says that no law applies. We can do whatever we want when it comes to controlling an epidemic. So that's kind of a law that's reacting to something that's happening in society, following society rather than leading society. And I think both these are ways in which laws have evolved over a period of time. It's not to say that one is right and the other is wrong, but I think there is a general point that which sort of relates back to the point that I was making about the legal culture in which a law operates, is that you can't have a law from left field that has no acceptability in society. Perhaps I think this is even truer now of judgments of courts, that sometimes you get these judgments that are well ahead of their time. And while sometimes that may be fine, you do think that for something to be actually implementable on the ground, what you actually need is, and this is the fundamental basis for all law being law, is that people accept it as the law. Right. I mean, if you go to the Dawkinian way of thinking about law, as in there was the older positivist ways that the law is the command of the sovereign that is enforceable by sanction. But then Dawkins comes in and says that no, it's not just that, as in that's the external aspect, but there is an internal aspect. I am not breaking this light, not because I know I will be fined 2,000 rupees, though that's a reason, but also because I know that this is the law and this is the right thing to do for a well-ordered society. So there is an internal reason, which has nothing to do with the fine that I have to pay for following the law. So I think that there is that social acceptability of the law is a very critical element, and that's why these pulls and pushes will always happen. So when the Sabrimala judgment was handed down, you do realize that this is something that has gone well ahead of where society perhaps is willing to be at this point of time. So there will be a pushback, and then we will arrive at somewhere that is acceptable. So I think the way that the law operates in India particularly is that it doesn't operate necessarily in the way that this is the way, which is how we think of the law, right? The law is essentially an instrument to make things more efficient, because then everyone doesn't have to second guess, right? There is a reason why there are traffic lights, so that you don't have to keep looking as to what the other person is doing. You can follow the light. But in India, and this is sort of a kind of incipient thought that I have, that the law is an instrument of negotiation. It's just another instrument of negotiation. Yes, that's what the law says, but now this is something that is really alien to a different cultural context, and we all have it somewhere within us. I remember, again, just to give you an example from my time in Oxford, as in every summer we had to clear out from our rooms because they wanted to give those rooms for conferences, and I had a lot of stuff. And I had a flight to catch. So I was like, yeah, I'll clear it out, but can I keep this one little loft where I can keep this stuff? And the person was like, no, you can't. If you do that, it's £13 a night. It's like keeping the room. Wow. Okay. So I was like, she said that's the rule. So I was like, okay, I get it, but it's only a loft. So what about I pay you £1 a night? And the person just didn't know how to respond to that. Like, I realized that it was not like we were having a conversation anymore. She was like, what? I mean, this is alien because it's not in the playbook. There is no such thing in the playbook. So then you realize that there is a lot to do with the culture in which a law operates. And I think in India there is a lot of wiggle room that exists even with the law.
Yeah, so my friend, Shruti Rajgopalan says about me that for Amit, traffic lights are but a mere suggestion. I mean, in Bombay after midnight, I mean, come on, like, what's the point?
That's right. But you're always trying to take a call, right? Because my parents used to live in Bombay for 12 years. And I remember this, that Haji Ali I always stopped at. Because I felt that Haji Ali was a major one. But when you go forward from Haji Ali and that Mahalakshmi temple, that even if it was red, I went on Pedder Road. So, you just always are. And this is not, you can't really rationalize it, and everyone will be making their own decisions.
Yeah, I remember I was in New Jersey a few years back staying with a friend, Yazad Jal, and one day I said, hey, I want to take your car for a spin. I want to drive in America. So I took his car out for a spin, and at one point there's a traffic light, but it's like 1 a.m. and there's absolutely no one there. So I just went through, and Yazad was like, stop, what are you doing? You can't do that here. And then he immediately gets a notification on his phone for the fine he has to pay.
That's right.
Yeah. So tell me more about, that journey after Oxford, that you decide to come back. But come back and do what? What was that journey to Vidhi sort of like in that period?
Yeah, so when I was in Oxford as a PhD student, you just end up having a lot of free time because there's only that much time that you can spend on reading articles on one subject. My work was on judicial appointments in India. Very topical, has remained topical over a period of time, but there's only an extent to which I could really talk about that. And at that point of time, there was India had signed this Indo-US nuclear deal, and we had to have this nuclear liability legislation that had to come in to operationalize the deal. And together with a friend of mine, Prashant Reddy, who was a classmate of mine from NLS, now writes on pharma regulation and
he
IP.
co-wrote that book with Dinesh Thakur.
Exactly, the Truth Bill. Yeah. So Prashant and I decided that we will send in an unsolicited report to the standing committee critiquing the bill and making suggestions on how to improve it. And so we did that. And it was a long 90-page submission because we had lots of free time on our hands. And one thing led to another, and we were called to depose before the standing committee. So we were, 26 years old or 27 years old at that time. It was a great opportunity. You're coming back to Parliament. You're called in. So we went in. It was a long 1 hour deliberation before the standing committee. It first busted my myth that all politicians are up to no good. Right? They wanted to do the right thing. But we have this general middle class notion that politicians don't want to do anything. It's all dumb, but it busted that myth very clearly because there were about 30 members on that committee, and you could see that the question of nuclear liability was a difficult question for them. It was a technical matter. There were issues of compliance with international law. There were some conventions that India had signed. There was also our own history of the Bhopal gas tragedy and how Dow got away. So there were lots of competing tensions, and they wanted to do a balancing act that worked both for the people of India, but also made sure that the deal was operationalized. So we came in, and we were sort of classic technocrats in that sense, giving some heavily technocratic legal solutions. And so we had an hour-long deposition. It was great. And then after that, we got a call from the minister saying that why don't you help us draft some sections? I still remember, because you're talking about Bombay, I was outside the Inox theater in Nariman Point, because it was my holiday. I wanted to watch this movie called Taxi Number 911. It's a terrible movie. My time would have been better spent on nuclear liability than Taxi Number 911. But I hammered through a draft of some kind over the course of that night, and together with Prashant, as in we submitted it. And 2 out of those 17 suggestions became the law of the land. Not that it helped the cause, because there was still a lot that was broken. Uh, but as graduate students, this was absolutely earth-shattering, right? One moment you send in some unsolicited report, the next moment what you've given has become suddenly the law. And it's like, wow, what has happened here? But as citizens, also you realize that this is a bit scary, for lack of a better word, because who are we? What do we know about the subject? No one asked us these questions. हाँ 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 ये तो ऑक्सफोर्ड से कर रहे हैं, ये तो ठीक ही होंगे. It was this kind of sentiment. So we realized there that there is a gap that exists inside the governmental machinery, which is that good ideas don't make it to good legislation. So that's where the seed of Vidhi was born. That can we as lawyers not wait for disputes to arise and then come in on the act and try to solve it, whether through a regular bipartite dispute or through a public interest litigation of some kind. But can we do this upstream? Can we try and help make better laws in areas that we are competent? And so after that, for about a year and a half, as we continue working with some standing committees of parliament, some ministries, we work on the Judicial Standards and Accountability Bill, then we worked on a public procurement legislation. There was an enemy property legislation, which was very interesting, about properties of persons who migrated to Pakistan, and what would happen to them. There was a huge case around the Raja of Mahmudabad that was happening at that time. So kind of diverse and eclectic range of cases. And then after doing that for about a year and a half, it was heady stuff. As in, it was, you were talking to secretaries in government, ministers, and you're like, okay, this is really interesting, and I think there could be something here. There was a sense that this is time to either commit or quit, because I was at that time a lecturer and I had to apply for a job. As in, if I wanted to stay on in the country, I had to apply for a regular tenured position. And I was clear I wanted to go back to India. I wasn't keen on applying for the job. I would have, as a default option of a lawyer who wants to give back in some shape or form, is to do litigation. Right? This is all what our predecessors used to do, as in those who wanted to give back. So I would have gone into litigation, but then by this time this idea had gained a certain amount of traction, and so we felt that maybe this is time to see whether we can set up Vidhi full time. And at that point of time, there were many people who helped us. As in, foremost there were 2 people actually who helped us immensely right at the outset before we even began. There was Dr. Ashok Ganguly, who was former chairman of Hindustan Lever, and he was then member of parliament in the Rajya Sabha. He was very bored sitting in Delhi because parliament was never functioning. And he actually gave me the confidence to say that if you want to do it, I'll help you in trying to find the right funders. Because I was an academic from Oxford, as in that too, risk averse Bengali. So it's not as if I was going to come to Delhi, rock up and start my own thing, as this seemed all very alien. So I think he gave the confidence that this idea has some merit and maybe you should think about doing it on your own. And the other person who encouraged us greatly at that time was Arun Jaitley. Arun Jaitley was the leader of the opposition at that time. He was a lawyer, so he like many lawyers, he spent his summers in London. So I had met him on a number of occasions there, and it was it was a very different political time, because there were people from all political parties who were sitting together. Maybe they still do in London, I don't know. As you said, what happens there is a different story, as long as you don't bring it here. But he gave us the confidence that the governmental system would genuinely benefit from the type of things that we were that we were doing. And so then we said that, okay, this idea has some merit. And my parents were very supportive at that time as well. And so, yeah, and so I came back for a year, tried to get some funding to get this going, managed to get some funding. And we started from a basement in Jangpura in Delhi in 2013, four of us. Another similarly cold day like this, almost exactly 10 years back. So that's what the journey from Oxford back to Delhi was like.
I'm curious about the why. Because you've done all of this, you've studied law, you've, Rhodes Scholarship, gone to Oxford, been a lecturer there. The opportunity cost for you for doing something like this is huge because there is so much else you can do. You could choose a career in academia, which you said you weren't interested in, you wanted to come back. But even having come back here, you could have chosen, I'm assuming, a career in corporate law, which is far more lucrative and remunerative and etc., and not kind of gotten into this. So what is driving you?
No, I had closed the option of corporate law a long time back. I wasn't cut out for it. I wasn't good at it. And I was not going to do that. And I think the deeper point is that I genuinely haven't thought of my life's choices in terms of opportunity costs. Maybe it's a good thing that I didn't do economics in college. But I've just gone with what I felt is right. And this hasn't perhaps always been the most rational decision. But it does go back to this sense of purpose. This is a question that you asked earlier. And I felt that as a lawyer and certainly as a citizen, I wanted to give back. This was a very strong sentiment that I've always had. I haven't really deconstructed why I have that sentiment, but I guess there's a range of factors that have impelled it. So I was always clear that I wanted to give back. And I was looking for the right vehicle to do so. Litigation was the default choice for lawyers, as I said, but it always felt suboptimal to me because a law has been passed, some action has been taken, someone has been hurt by that action, and then a lawyer has stepped in to try and solve this problem. So it seemed like a suboptimal way of dealing with a problem at any sense of scale, right? As it is a micro case, it's great, and it also played to what my mother thought was my greatest strength of public speaking. So I think, but those apart, and it didn't really seem like the best way to solve a problem at scale, and that's really what I was looking for, because I was looking for the macro of the law and not really the micro. And this is what my time in Oxford had also given me, that the system, that law itself, as you go deeper and deeper into the field, as it is essentially a lot of very fine micro points. It's almost like neurosurgery, right? I mean, this kind of fine reasoning, subtle distinctions. As in, this is what is really the cutting edge of the law or a legal argument or legal reasoning. I was more interested in the big picture. And if you are interested in the big picture and you're looking at something at scale, and you still want to do law and not start some kind of retail company, then I think you would necessarily look at Parliament and you would look at making of laws. And Vinny seemed to fit. That it seemed like a good way of I could give back. I could give back in a way that played to my strengths. And it was an idea that, most importantly, had some proof of concept. And I'll be perfectly honest, I wouldn't have been able to start Vinny if I had not been in Oxford at that time. Because it was easier for me at that point of time with a card that said lecturer in law at Oxford to get any appointment that I wanted to in Delhi than it is now after 10 years and a great body of what I think is a great body of work. It's still much harder now. It was much easier at that point of time to do it. And I think that is just the power of the brand and also our colonial hangover.
Yeah, indeed. No, and I love the sense of trying to engage with the big picture, which I imagine would be both much more stimulating and also much more consequential, because you make a much bigger difference that way. When Vidhi started and you're entering that legal ecosystem as a completely new kind of player, tell me a bit about what the problem statement is. Like, what is wrong with the ecosystem and what is the role you're looking to play that fills those gaps?
Yeah. So our mission was a very simple one. We want to write better laws for India. and that's remained the mission for the last 10 years. It may have evolved and developed some facets, but that was the core proposition of what Vidhi stood for. And what was the problem? The problem was that at that point of time, I remember we had a pitch document which said that the problem is 5 C's, that our laws are not clear. They are written in this dense legal jargon that nobody understands. Can we make them clear? Our laws are often not constitutional. Many examples of that. Don't need to get into it. Our laws are all offer always not coherent, because you realize that, like a club sandwich, as in you're putting layer on layer, okay, and you have to be a little bit careful as to what you're putting on each. You just can't put on basically a roti on top of a piece of bread and
Mustard and mayo wouldn't go together. Yeah.
that kind of stuff. So it's not coherent. So you have to see what it is that where this is fitting in. Laws are not compliant with our international obligations. There's a shocking ignorance of international law in this country. There are a handful of people who do it well, but there was no understanding of that. And laws are not contemporaneous. And this, I think, was the biggest problem, is that in India we felt that the question that we ask fundamentally when we are drafting a law is not, what is the problem I'm trying to solve with this law? You'd imagine that is the basic question that you're trying to ask. The basic question that I often found that we ask is, how is this done in Europe? How is this done in the US? How can we adapt it to India? And I felt that I'm not saying that this is not a relevant question. It's a relevant question, but it's surely a second or third order question. The first question is, what is the problem that I'm trying to solve in India? And I was part of this committee that worked on data protection. And I think the first question should always have been that, what is the privacy problem that we're trying to solve here? As in, is the privacy problem only Aadhaar? Is it also Gmail? I mean, is it also the guy at the airport? As in, what is the problem that we are trying to solve here? But instead of that, I think the first question that we were often asking was that, what does the GDPR say, and how do we try and translate that into India? So so these were the 5 clear problems that we felt existed in our legal system, and the pitch was clear that here we are, a group of 6 smart individuals who have, as you said, had huge opportunity costs, have given all that up and come back to help you make better laws. So now please give us the laws to work on. Of course, things don't work out quite like that. I think, so for the first 1.5 years, it was just a lot of hard research. So original research in various areas where we think change was needed. So we put out reports on the laws that need to be repealed. So there were 100 laws that we identified together with NIPFP and Center for Civil Society, that 100 laws that need to go. There was an early piece of work that we had done on why India needs a privacy and data protection legislation. And there were several other things around the judicial reforms that we had done. So there was a lot of that right at the outset. And then there were 2 projects that came through. One was, you had KP Krishnan on, and KP Krishnan was the bureaucrat whom we worked with on the insolvency and bankruptcy code. So my colleague Devanshu Mukherjee worked on that, taking the code from idea to fruition. And it was the 14th Finance Commission was also constituted at that time. Dr. Mayvi Reddy was the chairperson of that commission, and we worked with that Finance Commission on this issue of cesses and surcharges, which seemed like has become a proxy way of imposing a tax but not sharing revenue with states. So these were 2 issues that we worked on, and then we realized that the idea that we had right at the outset, that there is and this is something that you hear on a lot of your shows, there is a woeful lack of state capacity, and we were here to fill a tiny part of that gap, which was that we were trying to ensure that we had good policy ideas, and that was translated into effective legislation.
It would be tempting for someone with identical concerns to yours, saying that, working with government is so hard, movement can be glacial at times, there can be so many frustrations, that why don't I just sit on the outside and build a public profile and bring out all these great papers, and, all my positions can have a certain purity and I'm never compromising, I don't have to enter these difficult conversations. But instead, And some people have made that kind of choice, and instead you made the choice that no, we are going to get into the weeds and we're going to engage and all of that. Give me a sense of what those engagements were actually like in terms of the day-to-day interactions. Was it frustrating? You mentioned before, and I completely agree from all the episodes I've done, that politicians and bureaucrats in this country, so many of them actually have a sense of purpose. They want to make a change, but the incentives are all completely screwed up and the system is completely messed up. So how did you, and by the time you started with it, you knew all of this because you'd done some work with government, you'd been in the sort of thereabouts around the system during this time. So what was this kind of process like of engagement? How receptive were politicians to you? How receptive were bureaucrats to you? And what was the kind of give and take that happened? Give me a sense of like this engine room of making laws, as it were.
Yeah. So I think first up, the government of India and state governments remain the largest change agents in the country. Now, whether that's a good thing or not, we can debate. But the fact is that both the governments themselves, in their self-perception, as well as the people in their perception of governments, see them as Mai Baap Sarkars. And they are there to do everything. And I'm coming around to the view that is something that needs to be fundamentally rethought in terms of, I think, the idea of individuals for sure that we know of, but also the idea of communities, which I think is a critically overlooked part of political theory in India, needs to be thought through much more closely in this individual versus state dynamic. But more on that later. The government of India and the state governments were the largest change agents in the country. So we knew that if we wanted to make change, then we would have to engage with them. There was no way other than engagement. The second point was that if I wanted to be an academic and maintain that purity of thought, then I would have just remained in Oxford. Right? And why would I come back here? And some friends of mine had, and great respect to them, but it's basically you're stuck with a lot of teaching, and essentially you're marking papers most of the time, and you can do that. It's a price that you pay for earning your freedom of doing research. But the fact is that why would I do that in a suboptimal setting? So it was always clear to us that we wanted to see the impact of the work that we do, and that is what actually made Vidhi an attractive proposition for my colleagues who joined on as part of the founding team, and for the 250 odd lawyers who have come after, that we get to see the impact of the work that we do. And this is the reason as to why people are happy to take a cut of their salaries. The opportunity cost for everyone is high, but to come and work in Vidhi because they see that they are part of something larger. And I think there is a kind of deeper human sentiment that we want to be part of something larger. And so that is essentially the reason why this wasn't even much of a question in our heads. That yes, this is going to be hard. Yes, this is going to be slow. But this is a monopoly. I mean, this is a monopoly that I mean, you'd hope actually that there wouldn't be a duopoly or a oligopoly, though we are kind of heading in that direction. But you have to work with the state as if you want to make real change happen when it comes to laws, because the state is the only legally empowered entity to
monopoly
make
on violence. So.
Monopoly on violence, monopoly on laws. This is the system that we are in, and we were not anarchists. And so that's the why we did it. As far as the engine room is concerned, in terms of what that was like, the first big realization was, and this is the time we are working under the NDA government. This is 2000. So we started 2013, but what I'm talking about now is 2014-15. Is that government is not a monolith. And I think this is the biggest realization that I've had over 10 years, is that there is a perception of the government of being a certain way, as in depending on where you are and what kind of conversation you're having. Either it's this authoritarian state that is plunging India into darkness, or it's the greatest thing that has happened since sliced bread, depending on who you're talking to. The fact is, I realize that both of these are equally untrue, because government is not a monolith. There are, as you said, there are a number of people there, many of whom, and I would say, stick my neck out and say a vast majority of whom are trying to do the right thing. And we worked primarily with bureaucrats, and we realized that that was a way that we could also ensure our independence. Because at Vidhi, very early on, we realized that there are three values that define us: independence, excellence, and impact. So we want to be independent and work with any government, irrespective of political party, but we will only work with governments because we think governments can change things, so not with parties. Second, we want to be the best at what we do, whether it is the law we draft or the tea we serve in our office. And third is that we want to ensure that there is impact, that the work that we do, we can see it through. Now, these are all goals. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. But right at the outset, we realized that, and this is something that I felt, that there are two things that can make change happen. And the first is high quality work. There are very few people, certainly people within the governmental mechanism machinery, don't have the time or the capacity to do research. You don't even expect them to do it. Okay. But bureaucrats are very good at spotting faff and waffle and kind of separating the wheat from the chaff. They are very good at doing that. So they know when you're talking shit or when you're making sense. So the first thing is that we need to produce high quality work. That's the first important ingredient of success. And the second is that we have to approach whoever it is that we are working with in a genuine spirit of engagement. So right at the outset, there were a lot of this, ye to bacche hai, bataiye, so there was all that kind of stuff. There was this patronizing stuff that you get a lot of. But we felt that there were always about 6 out of 10 IAS officers who saw merit in what we were doing. And this is across areas, whether in center or in states. So, and I think we needed to find those internal champions to be able to work with them and to be able to ensure that the work that we do translates. Okay. Now, the second big realization is that when we came in, we felt that, oh, we are going to change things. We're going to make things better. And because we have the ideas, we know what is to be done. We'll talk to people. We'll make sure that we get the best law that we deserve. But the second big realization was no one can say that they have themselves drafted a law or that this law was their idea. I mean, legitimately, perhaps only a politician can claim that because ultimately it's their fate on the line. But no one can really say that they have done it because it is a genuinely collective effort. And I think sometimes, when we think, particularly in this climate, when we see that parliament is dysfunctional, I think there is a sense that checks and balances are going. I think parliamentary checks and balances are certainly going. Judicial checks and balances are a mixed record. But executive government too is not a monolith. Now, there might be some very hot button issues which may matter a lot to particular political parties. Okay, so whether you're talking about the Article 370 abrogation for this government, whether you're talking about Manrega for the UPA government, there may be some which are political hot buttons. But other than that, for your regular legislation which affects lives of people, there are so many people involved in that lawmaking process. So you wanted that idea of the engine room. Now, the idea of a law emanates at the nodal ministry. So let me give you an example of this data protection bill. It emanated with the Ministry of Electronics and IT. That ministry set up a committee, which usually they do in terms of important legislation. That committee it will have government officers, it will have outsiders, it will have some kind of mix. That committee will submit a report. Either it will have a draft law alongside the report, or on the basis of that, someone in the ministry or outsourced by the ministry will draft a law. That will be the first draft. Once that first draft is done, that draft will go first up the line in the ministry, right up from whoever has drafted it, joint secretary, additional secretary, minister. It will have to be cleared. Then it will go for interministerial consultation, especially on important ones. So then it will come back, you will get a lot of responses. Then it will go for public consultation, which has happened most of the time. Sometimes, unfortunately, it hasn't, but most of the time it has happened. So you get a range of responses from the public. All this gets put together, and then you have the final version of the legislation that is finalized by that ministry. Then that goes to the law ministry. The law ministry again then suggests a hazard changes to this, making it legally sound and whatever, some of the things that I spoke about. Then this ministry has to be happy with it. Once both of them agree, the law ministry puts this up before cabinet. Now, cabinet, usually things might go through, but because the interministerial consultation has happened, but some minister might say something. And there is that even one word which is kind of seems semi-negative can postpone the bill. So everyone has to have some consensus, and there's not always consensus in these. But once cabinet says yes and it gets cabinet approval, only then does it get to parliament. And then parliament is a different story. So there are a lot of wheels within wheels, wheels within wheels, which in my view, there are problematic elements of that, because then you get kind of that purity of a prop that first draft goes. But net, it makes a law better, because as long as you ensure that there is a diversity of voices and a diversity of viewpoints that get factored in, and there is good faith incorporation of that, net, that diversity of voices makes the law better. Of course, Parliament is the apogee of that. Like, that's where you get the real diversity, because this is still a kind of closed diversity. So one can only hope that the Parliament becomes functional again. I'm a bit cynical in this regard, just in the way in which governments are going globally, and that standing committees of Parliament can be resuscitated, but those would make laws truly consultative and would make them better. But this is really the process, and this has been followed for all laws. We've worked on about 369 laws and rules of center and states in the course of the last 10 years. And there's obviously some variations here and there, but largely this is the process that's been.
So where is Vidhi in the process, and where do laws originate? Like, are you there at the committee stage? Is it the case that a ministry will come to you and say, hey, we're thinking of doing this, we need help? Or is it the case that it works the other way, that you give a paper and make a suggestion and then they say, yeah, good idea, let's do it? How does that process take place?
So in three ways. One is that we are sometimes not there at all. When you have a truly radical research idea and you want to pitch it, then we are basically trying to ensure that someone in government meets us and likes the idea. So an example of that is that it is our view that consumption of small quantities of drugs is not a criminal law enforcement issue, but a public health issue. We must invest in de-addiction centers and not in jails. Okay. So this is a completely different approach, saying decriminalize drug consumption. And we did this project in Punjab, where essentially you're looking at 40% of Punjab's farmers who are of Punjab's youth, as in who are between the age of 15 and 35, right? So you're not kidding me, right? That you're going to put 35% of these people in jail. You're not going to do that. No government is ever going to do that. So all you're doing is essentially creating opportunities for rent seeking for some local policeman. So I mean that, and of course there were many other reasons for saying that we have to think of this as an addiction problem. As there was a quote that my friend found, and I can't remember who it was by, but it said that, if somebody has tuberculosis, it's not like you're going to put that person in prison. You're going to get that person treated. But what we are doing is putting addicts, who are essentially people who are sick in some way, in prison and hoping that it'll get better. It's shocking. It's absolutely shocking. But at that point in time, there were no takers for that idea right at the outset. So this is where we want to be in the room. As there's that line in Hamilton where it says that I want to be in the room where it happens. So in this, we are not in the room where it happens. We want to be in the room where it happens because we think that there is an idea that is worthy of consideration. We started that in 2015. Now it's 9 years. I think we've made some headway. There was a encouraging statement by the Home Minister that we have to treat them with sympathy, that addicts are not criminals, which was extremely encouraging, because politicians always want to be seen as macho on crime. And I think a lot of mainstream opinion after this Riya Chakraborty and this Aryan Khan case has turned, saying that what are we doing putting these type of people in prison? It doesn't make sense. But of course, this is really the tip of the iceberg. The people who you are really putting in prison are your daily wage laborers and so on, who you're picking up and putting in prison. So that's one part. Sometimes we have a paper that we present to the government and say that, you know what, this is what we think the contours of this law could look like. So the bankruptcy code is a good example of that. The first draft of the data protection bill is a good example of that, where we have a paper, we have an idea, which government is also keen on. And so then we work with the government to try and translate that idea into a draft legislation which will be actionable. And sometimes it happens the other way, which is that government has an idea. We have our own impact criteria on what we think are ideas that we will work on. And there are three criteria. One is that we must be competent to work on them. Two, it must be a large enough problem, again, on this macro versus micro issue. And three is that we must ensure that there is an internal champion who will see it through, because otherwise we felt that on these ideas there's a lot of waste of time. So there are many ideas of this nature. So currently something that we are working on is in relation to the real estate sector. There's lots of pending RERA cases, and RERA, which started off with a lot of promise, as it needs to, we need to take a deeper look as to how the system is working, try and see as to what improvements are needed to ensure that home buyers are protected. So that's a project that we're working on. It's not an original idea of ours. It's something that the ministry wants to do, which we feel fits our impact criteria. And so we work with the ministry in order to produce that first draft. Over the course of the last 10 years, as in, we've come to the view that if we can make impact in that first draft and can shape the contours of that first draft, then you've got a fundamentally good product. I mean, there will be changes on that. I mean, the data protection bill is a good example as to how there are pretty significant changes on that first draft. But the basic structure of what you have put down remains, because it takes a lot of time and a lot of knowledge to be able to fundamentally rework the basis of a draft, because most of the changes that happen are, cut out these words, put something else, cut out and make it that kind of stuff, and we live with that. So we think that if we can be there with the nodal ministry and try and work with them on getting a good first draft after getting consultations from people, I think that would be that's the place where we can ensure both that we maintain our independence and can ensure impact.
Have you ever been in a situation where you're asked to work on laws or perhaps take some existing law in a particular direction which you are not comfortable with because it doesn't align with your values? And how do you deal with that?
Many times. In fact, this is a question that we ask for most of our interview candidates, that, you're asked to draft a law where there is where the bureaucrat is saying that we must have the death penalty, and you are morally opposed to it. What would you do in that situation? So we did have that situation. I won't get into the details of which law it was or who it was, but we did have that situation. And there you present your point of view. And I think here there's an advantage, because at the end of the day, we are lawyers and it is our job to provide independent legal advice. So as Vidhi, we will never say that we drafted this law. We didn't. We assisted in the drafting of laws by providing our inputs. And in this we said that for ABC reasons, we think that death penalty will not be a deterrent in this case. Okay? It will not help you serve the purposes that it is. This is our independent view. Now take it or leave it, because at the end of the day, it's their law. So this has been our standard point everywhere, is the fact that we will try to persuade you that this does not work. But if our persuasion fails, then at the end of the day, it is a law that is drafted by the Parliament of India and it is presented to the Parliament by the Government of India, and they are legitimate to do it. Now, we may not like it, but it is not our law. So that's how we deal with this situation, and this happens quite often. I mean, this death penalty, I gave this example because it's an extreme example, but it happens always. But I think there is a lot that you can work out if somebody has an open mind and is willing to be persuaded. And if they are not willing to be persuaded, then you try your best and you move on.
You've mentioned in a recent interview that among the things you do, there are three ways to bring about better laws: original research, engagement, and shaping the public narrative. And you've already spoken about original research and engagement. Tell me a bit more about shaping the public narrative and how big a part that plays in, your scheme of things. How does one go about it and so on?
Yeah, so we realized this during this decriminalization of drugs issue, which was actually one of the first times when we realized that, and this actually riffs off a point that we were making earlier, that it has to be the right environment for change. Like, a law operates in a particular context. So we realized that with decriminalization, that the idea of decriminalization itself was too radical for people to buy. It's like, no, these are drug addicts. The shady. I said, how can you put them in a de-addiction center and you feed them 3 meals a day? I said, put them in jail. So there's this kind of prevailing sentiment. And until and unless that you can attack that sentiment in some shape or form, the law will not fully change, or even if it changes, it will not have that acceptability. So we realized then that the way to do that, first up, is by ensuring that, and this was the first time that we put out our report in Punjabi.
Wow.
So this was hard work because it's not just a case of translation, as in it was extremely difficult to do that. But we put it out in Punjabi because we realized that first it cannot be something that these English speaking people from Delhi have come and told us to do. That's the first. The second thing is that we realized that we need to humanize this story. So I may be getting this slightly wrong, but I think there was a locality called Makbulpura outside Amritsar, which was known as the locality of widows, because essentially each of the men in the house were, first arrested and then died of some drug-related offense. And that was also, it spun off an independent piece of research as to why are women not drug addicts, and this is my colleague Neha Singhal had done that. That was interesting as well. But we realized that you have to humanize this, but by saying that basically this is destroying families. This is not a esoteric question of whether you should consider something a public health issue or a law enforcement issue, but this is a question of how do you keep families whole. And, so that became a kind of critical part of that campaign. So in Punjabi, we collaborated with a lot of grassroots organizations in Punjab, worked with PGI in Chandigarh, with their de-addiction center there, and continued to had many interesting meetings with the government at that point of time, which understood what we were saying because they knew that this was not going to work. So shaping the public narrative sets really the base for reform, particularly on reforms which are generational. So if you're going to decriminalize drugs, then that is a reform that actually will take 20 to 25 years of time. And this is another realization that impact and reform takes time. So whenever we have reforms of this nature, which is the system is not ready for, and which is mostly stuff in social justice, in healthcare, in education. This is stuff that the system is not ready for, and again, a range of factors for that. I think there is where we feel the need that there is a critical need to shape the public narrative. So to give you another example, we've been doing this case in the Supreme Court for a long time on dying with dignity, end of life care, or living wills. So that you should have a living will saying, if I have ABC, I don't want to be put on a ventilator and it should be taken off. We had intervened in a petition that Common Cause had actually initially filed in 2015. Then we got a favorable order. Then that order did allow for living wills in the country, but allowed it in such a convoluted fashion that you needed a judicial magistrate first class to sign on this, that. You knew it was unworkable. Then we got another order. We got the Constitution Bench of the Supreme Court to revise its earlier order and clarify and make it a little bit more workable. Still not wholly workable, but a little bit more workable. And then we worked with the All India Institute of Medical Sciences to develop an end-of-life care policy for them, hoping that that will become the template for other hospitals. We are now working with the Ministry of Health to finally come up with a uniform definition of death in the country, because that's also an issue as to when is a person considered dead, and move towards palliative care. And we realized there that the Supreme Court actually is a good way for raising the profile on issues, much more than it is on actually changing things on the ground. Because my father-in-law wanted to register a living will after the Supreme Court order, and the magistrate that he went to said that I haven't received this order. I mean, you don't have to. There's a provision in the Constitution which says that this is now the law of the land. But he said, no, I'm sorry. I understand what you're saying is right, but I have to receive a notification from the High Court.
Wow.
Saying that this is now I can do this. Otherwise, how can I register this? It's not within my scope of powers. Ye dekhiye, this is my scope of powers. Where is it written? He's right. It's not written. Now, this is how the administrative mechanism functions. So, we realize that there is a lot that happens after a judgment is delivered. I mean, particularly in cases like this in social justice, environmental law, judgments may be great, but what happens on the ground is different. But it's great for raising the profile on issues. So I think there's a lot of public momentum around end of life care, and we are part of an alliance working with a group of doctors called the End of Life Care Task Force in order to ensure that there is a decent, dignified death that everyone can have instead of being tubed up in hospitals when you don't want to do it. So shaping the public narrative is critical whenever you're talking about reforms that's going to take a long time. And so we found it's unfortunate that mostly in areas of our work around health, disability, education, these are areas where we need to shape the public narrative much more, whereas work around financial regulation, data protection, AI, this is where the political economy of reform is favorable. So there's a lot more direct engagement with government.
And it seems to me that these are, there are two really different things coming up side by side with each other. And one of them is that when you're in the business of working with government to frame laws and etc., you go at a really slow pace. You go within a window of what is acceptable, and progress can be slow and it's an inch at a time, and you make a difference in the margins. When you aim for public engagement, especially of big issues like this, you are trying to shift the Overton window at some level. That is when long-term change really happens. And for those of my listeners who haven't heard the term, the Overton window is really that window of what is acceptable in a public debate. So, if you take an extreme position on one side, say on the side of freedom, then you help make people at the edges of the Overton window more acceptable and seem more mainstream. So that shifts. So how does this kind of work? Because then isn't there some dissonance here, right? If the government that you're working with also sees you be public with positions that are pretty extreme, does that color how they feel about you? And how does that work?
Yeah, so the way I see this is that independence and impact is on a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum is complete independence, and the other end of the spectrum is this fictional idea of complete impact. If you want to be completely independent, then basically it's what you called have that purity of thought. You stay out. You write your papers. What impact happens then is completely contingent. It's not in your hands, and you're willing to make that sacrifice, and you're saying that I leave that to other people. And that's where I maintain my complete integrity. And that's a fair position to take. On the other hand, what I would call complete independent impact is basically what law firms do. Right? Law firms essentially very openly are in service of their client. Right? So the client wants X. Law firm's job is to go and get that X to happen without, of course, while following the law. So there you're happy to toe the line. If there is a call that you take which is unconscionable, maybe you're willing to do that because it gets you what you want. Okay. So this is what I define as complete impact. Now, anybody who wants to do a little bit of both, and somewhere all of us, and this goes back to life not being black and white, somewhere all of us want to do a bit of both, right? You want to be independent largely in what you're saying, but you also want to see, by all of us, all of us at Vidhi who want to do this, all of us, I don't want to speak for everybody, but you also want to see the impact of the work that you do. And it's about straddling this line. And so far in the course of the last 10 years, and we have worked with the previous UPA government, now the NDA government for 10 years, and in 7 states, so lots of state governments, I think people largely respect the fact that you can have an independent position on issues while also being able to work with them. Now, it's true that perhaps over the course of the last few years, there is a general sense that this space is shrinking of being able to do this. I personally have not felt it, but I know colleagues who have, and whether it Vidhi or outside, as in there are many who have felt it. But the fact of the matter is that, again, I say this, that the fact that we are lawyers and provide professional independent advice is maybe something that's working for our benefit. So if it's something that they don't like, talk to another lawyer. And go with that person's advice. So my sense is that there is everybody in this spectrum of lawmaking, and that includes certainly government who's actually making the laws, lawyers who are assisting them in making them well, technocrats who are giving the policy ideas, persons in civil society, some of whom may be supportive of the law, some of whom may be opposing the law, and others who are in virulent opposition of the law. Everybody plays a role in making the law better. And I saw that firsthand when we worked on Aadhaar. And it was our point of view at that point of time that Aadhaar is a hugely powerful tool for social welfare delivery in the country. The biggest criticism at that point of time was that it was the largest biometric identification program that was happening without any law. So we felt that it was commonsensical when we were asked to help in drafting the law, that we draft the law. And so then one big obstacle, which is that you're having this by executive fiat, goes, that you now have a law which has been debated and has been passed by Parliament. And so you do that. And there, as in we were right at the beginning, that we were bombarded by criticism. That you're helping set up a surveillance state, as in you're ensuring that tracking and so on. And the fact is that, now it's what? Now it's almost like 7 years. As in, I would certainly take up this Aadhaar case again. As in, if it was offered to me, as in then, you have to draft an Aadhaar Act today, I would do it again. Absolutely. Because I continue to believe that it is the biggest tool for for direct benefit transfers. And we could see that during COVID in terms of the amount of savings and so on. And when you're talking about large technological systems, then you have to always strive to make it better. I mean, I don't think that we can be Luddite and say that we don't want this at all. I mean, yes, we can decide as to where we want it and where we don't want it, but I don't think that that's an option to say that we don't want technology. I think we want responsible technology. And at that point of time, as in frankly, some of the criticism really irritated me, and that I was impulses of my youth. As I was perhaps a little bit more strident than I should have in retrospect. As someone in the government had said to me once, there can only be two types of dals: a naram dal and a garam dal, and I always belong to the garam dal. But I've over time softened, I think. And I feel that every person, certainly someone scholarly like Usha Ramanathan, who was completely ideologically opposed to the bill. There were others. I mean, you had Apar on your show, as in who was opposed but engaging. There were people like Rahul, who you also had on your show, who were supportive of the bill, but at the same time maintain their independence. And there were folks within the government, whether it's Ram Sevak Sharma, as in who was the CEO, then Ajay Bhushan Pandey, who was the CEO during the time of the drafting of the Aadhaar Act, who all saw this argument. It's not like they didn't see it. It's not like there was some ideological drive to crush the dissent of any kind. And I think every person contributes to the law that you ultimately get. And I think all that opposition made this law better, made sure that we have a data protection bill, which is now a law, and will also ensure that this is not the end, that it will evolve into something that has even more safeguards for the citizens. So my sense is that it is possible to remain independent while working with governments. And this again goes back to the fact that government is not a monolith. And if it stays that way, then I think we'll be fine.
One of the things that's been happening recently that's kind of disturbing is that more and more, organizations outside the government which are full of English speakers, Lutyens elite as it were, and superficially you would, appear to look like one of them. There are more and more crackdowns on such organizations, like what's happened to CPR recently. It's just horrifying. It's a tragedy. But you guys have always kind of stayed out of that. Is that because you're not directly in the political crosshairs of anyone? You're just working with the deep state, like you said, and it's just bureaucrats, and that's where you are, and you can, pick and choose what you work on, and etc., etc. How does it all function? Because there is a certain perception out there that, hey, Vidhi is aligned with this government. And the moment you use a phrase like this government, it feels extremely simplistic to me because, like you said, it's not a monolith. But, how do you feel about that, and how does the criticism affect you?
Yeah, I think the short answer to this is the fact that in Delhi, I hear a lot of this, that Vidhi is aligned to this government. In Bombay, people think that we are aligned to the Congress party because Dr. Ashok Ganguly was a nominated member of the Congress party. So, there are all kinds of views that people have, as in, kuch to log kahenge, logo ka kaam hai kehna. So this kind of stuff actually doesn't bother me. Okay, I mean, it doesn't bother me at all. But what you said is that in terms of what the playbook is as far as we are concerned, and I think this goes back to something that is deeply personal for me, and I hope that in some sense, as in this is something that our founding team all believes in, is that we have to speak what we think is the truth, which in this case is the correct position of law. Now, that might be inconvenient in some cases. It might work in your favor in some cases. That's not our concern. This is something that we have done. for the last 10 years. And we have not bent to anybody in terms of trying to say something that they like, or we have not deliberately opposed somebody. I think the atmosphere that we are here in Delhi is that if you're seen like, if you're working with this government, you must be a part of this government. But the fact is that doesn't bother me because I work with the government of India, which is the biggest change agent in the country. So that's fine. And we have our criteria on which projects we work on, and as long as we can maintain that, I think that's something that we are happy to live with. And so if you can continue to, in that sense, speak honestly, say what it is that you want to, I think people will respect you. And this is largely the sentiment that I had. Of course, there are people who won't. Okay, and then you just know that those are not people you want to work with. And I'll be honest in saying that that's certainly not been the majority of people that we have worked with at all. I mean, the majority of people that we've worked with look much more like Tarun Bajaj and KP Krishnan than this mythical person who only wants you to say what he or she wants you to hear.
So we'll go in for a break. On the other side of the break, we'll talk about your wonderful book. But before that, a question which kind of intrigues me. You mentioned a colleague of yours, Neha, was working on, why don't women get addicted? So can you give me a short potted answer? Because now I'm kind of curious.
I don't know this.
But what are the theories?
No, so you have to speak to her, because I think the one is that a lot of this is not picked up, number one. And the second is that the men have gotten addicted first. So someone has to manage the household. It was something like that. So there were some data points on that. I'll share that with you.
Sure.
We'll keep that off the record. Yeah.
We'll keep that off the record. So let's go in for a little break.
Yeah,
and
sure.
on the other side. Hey, the music started and this sounds like a commercial, but it isn't. It's a plea from me to check out my latest labor of love, a YouTube show I am co-hosting with my good friend, the brilliant Ajay Shah. We've called it Everything is Everything. Every week, we'll speak for about an hour on things we care about, from the profound to the profane, from the exalted to the everyday. We range widely across subjects and we bring multiple frames with which we try to understand the world. Please join us on our journey and please support us by subscribing to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Amit Varma, AMITVARMA. The show is called Everything is Everything. Please do check it out. Welcome back to The Seen and the Unseen. I'm chatting with Arghya Sengupta on his wonderful book, The Colonial Constitution, and indeed on his life, because we haven't even mentioned the book so far. I want to come at this with a meta question first before we get down to talking about the book. Since the time I've been a columnist 20-something years ago, I keep often writing about our constitution, both in the sense that it is obviously a more liberal constitution than our society, but also in the many, many flaws that it has. Our rights aren't protected properly, especially the right to free speech has so many caveats and all that. And I have said this so often that it sounds cliched, that we have a constitution designed to rule us and not to serve us. That we are subjects and not citizens, that it is almost as if we replaced a bunch of white-skinned rulers with a bunch of brown-skinned rulers, and that's the only difference. So when your book came out and I saw the title, I was delighted. I said, ki finally, theek hai, a book length elaboration on this. But that particular fact seemed indisputable to me, because all through our history, across political parties, we've seen the damage that power can do. How power corrupts and, the effects of that. I had an episode with Gyan Prakash on the emergency where he pointed out that, listen, it wasn't unconstitutional. It was, power was centralized when the constitution was written because of the circumstances all around. Let's not pass judgment on, the people who wrote the constitution at the time, but it is terribly flawed. But after your book, what I sense more and more is that it is now not even kosher to discuss this. That somehow our discourse has reached a place where one group of people will hold out the Constitution to be a holy book that you cannot say anything bad about. And for another group of people, it is a root of all evils. And I have even seen that, like, when Apar was on my show, in fact, he kind of refused to even dignify the issue with discussion. He just didn't want to talk about that aspect of it. I see this also in many of the bad faith responses to your book. As if you have an agenda. And perhaps it's because you're associated with, he is associated with the government in some way. People have the mistaken impression that, hey, they are the whatever. And there is a noise in the right that, hey, we want to change the constitution. And it almost seems as if you're the standard bearer for that, which of course you're not, because as your book amply makes clear, most particularly in the epilogue, that's exactly the opposite of what you're asking for. All you're saying is, let's discuss this. And we were actually discussing it a while back, but now the discourse has become like this. Did this take you by surprise that the book would be received like this?
No, I expected this because, as you rightly said, we've reached a situation now where we cannot have any discussion on the Constitution because it's become this kind of holy book. And whenever I hear the term holy book, which is used for the Constitution a lot, I actually get worried. Because for me, when something is a holy book, without getting into too many nuances, the fact is that it is not something that can be engaged with. It is something that has to be followed. And that worries me. And I think that if there is one sure short way of ensuring that the Constitution recedes into oblivion, it is by treating it as a holy book. Because then no one has a view on the Constitution, everyone thinks it is something, and then suddenly, before you know it, it's something else. Because the holy book is nothing but the word of God, and it could just change if the God changes. So that is what actually is the present situation where we are in, as you rightly put it, and I think you've essentially paraphrased my book better than I ever could. But I want to challenge this. And so I'm not surprised that some of the responses have been like this. I think the instinctive responses have been of the kind that you've mentioned, where it's been seen as some kind of agenda. But I think people who have read the book, and once they have read the book, they have commented on it, they have found that this is perhaps more reasonable than they otherwise thought it might be. So I only point them to the age-old adage that just don't judge a book by its cover. But I think some of our old pearls of wisdom are often forgotten. So I'm not surprised by this response. But the fundamental point is, as you said, that it's a document that is large. And given that it's a document that is large, it is bound to have some good bits and some bad bits and some ordinary bits and some terrible bits. And this is not to chastise anybody. Everybody who wrote the Constitution did what they thought was the best for the country. And so the fact that we are writing this does not in any way mean that we are demeaning anybody. But I think at this point of time, and let me talk about the elephant in the room here. The elephant in the room is Ambedkar. And this is something that would have perhaps affected him more than anybody else. It's not possible now to have two views on a lot of Ambedkarite thought. And here is a person who was reviled by the communists, sidelined by the Congress, not given the time of day by the Parivar, who now suddenly has become everybody's poster boy. Right? So, and any engagement, let alone criticism, with his views is often seen as disrespect, not only to him, but to an entire community of Dalits. And I fundamentally resist these urges because I feel that, as I said, Ambedkar and Annihilation of Caste was one of the first eye-opening books for me. There's a lot that is remarkable in his thought, but no person is beyond critical engagement, and I think that we need to discuss the Constitution, and any discussion of the Constitution does not mean any disrespect for Ambedkar.
You know, like many people who straddled public life over decades, he contained multitudes. Like Gandhi, for example. Gandhi has 100 volumes. Ambedkar has, I forget the exact number, but a whole bunch of volumes. And, I did an episode on caste with Chandrabhan Prasad ji, the great Dalit scholar. And Chandrabhan made the excellent point that if you just read Ambedkar's later works, in fact, if you read all his works, it's a fascinating record of how he is changing his mind through time because of circumstance. In fact, the sort of importance he gave to socialism during the early debates on the framing of the Constitution. By the early 60s, he changed his mind in his writing. You know, there is a reason he had that view then. He's talking much more about markets and so on by the early 60s, and he's kind of shifted, and appreciating those multitudes is important. He's absolutely one of the great intellectuals of the 20th century, but to put him in a box and say, this is it, or to is kind of a folly. And I want to ask about, I think one misconception tons of people have has to do, and it's a well-meaning misconception, but it also, goes back to an Ambedkar quote where at one point when he's presenting the draft constitution, you quote him as saying, indeed, if I may say so, if things go wrong under the new constitution, the reason will not be that we had a bad constitution. What we will have to say is that man was vile. Stop quote. And today, with the benefit of hindsight, we can look back and say that no, the whole point of a constitution, as I think the American founders realize, the whole point of a constitution is to protect the people from the state, and therefore you build in those safeguards. So it doesn't matter if the vilest person on the planet is a president, your constitution will protect the people against that person. So it is not ki, the constitution is good, but we've elected the wrong people. That is nonsensical. It makes no sense. A constitution has to protect us all against the worst people coming to charge and against the worst possible excesses of majoritarian politics. And yet, it isn't just Ambedkar, but in that time of the framing, and you've quoted many people on this, there is this sense that, look, the people are, at by and large, are sort of ignorant and they need to be guided, and we are great people and we have their best interests in heart. So we will take care of all that, and the rules are framed accordingly, making that assumption. And of course, many of them were great people, but at the same time, you can't just make that assumption and assume that it will remain the case. In fact, when you centralize power so much, you are actually guaranteeing that the wrong kind of people will come into politics and that profile will change completely. So what is your thought on this? Like, is this in a sense one of the original sins at the heart of how we approach framing this constitution?
This was a sentiment that comes to us in many different ways, right? Our constitution is fine, our systems are fine, our people are bad, our politicians are bad. And I find these as intellectually lazy explanations of why we are in the state we are. Yeah, sure, maybe the people are bad. Okay, I'm no one to judge that. But the question is that the constitution is one of its key purposes is essentially catastrophe planning, to ensure, as you said, that even if power comes to the worst hands, can something fundamental about our nation and its values survive? And in that, I actually find it surprising that this heady optimism of the time swayed the framers of the constitution this much. And the reason I find it surprising is because of the fact that they were, in that sense, constitutional pundits, as Shankar Rao Deo described them. He was a congressman. He said that he was actually saying it rather wistfully, that our constitution is drafted by certain constitutional pundits who perhaps have great knowledge of constitutional law in other countries, but perhaps not much of a feel of what is the pulse of the nation. But because they had a knowledge of constitutional law in other countries, I would have expected that there would be greater realization of the fundamental premise on which the American Constitution is based, because the American Constitution was a great inspiration to our framers. And the American Constitution is based on the premise that man is vile. Man is evil, self-seeking, and only interested in personal ambition. And that is why they set up a system which is a system of designed gridlock, right? You want gridlock of some kind because out of the interstices of this gridlock, something good will emerge. So it seems very counterintuitive at the time, right? What you want is that you've now just won freedom from the British, you've gotten rid of the monarch, but what you want is not a system that replicates that, but what you want is a system that creates a sense of cautious gridlock, where and how do they do that? By ensuring that both the legislative and the executive wings are elected. Now, this is a radically new idea at that point of time, that you have the Senate that's elected, you have the House that's elected, and you also have the President who's directly elected. Why? Because they fear at that point of time that the legislature otherwise will become too powerful. So you need an elected president to kind of countervail that. And as Hamilton writes in the Federalist Papers, so that ambition counteracts ambition. That's one of the fundamental views. So people can cancel each other out, and out of that something good will emerge, because people know that they will have to get along. They will have to make these compromises. Now, the constitution framers knew all this. Now, despite that, to start with the view that people will be good because this country is now run by Indians, it will be run for Indians, I think is a touching thought. And And I can see where it's coming from. In that atmosphere, we've just won freedom after years of subjugation. As you can think that, yeah, we will now be the best versions of ourselves that we can be. But politicians are not like that, and people are not like that. You and I are not always good to other people. We are sometimes good, we are sometimes not good. We sometimes give somebody money at a traffic junction. Sometimes we don't. There may not always be reason that is guiding our actions. Sometimes it's just looking out for ourselves. Sometimes it's something else. We are inconsistent beings. As human beings, we try to be better, but we are fundamentally inconsistent. So it was surprising that this view was taken. And I think what the double whammy was what you said about centralization, is that this view that man will be good, this view was supplemented by this understanding that there will be a large state. And we want a state that is not going to oppress people's liberties but guarantee it. So I think this double whammy, that you have a large state and you think that this state will be the best version of itself that it can, is what creates this constitution which has its liberal bits but is essentially very statist and conservative.
When we talk of contingency, one obvious contingency that I've spoken of often in the past is that, look, the country was falling apart. There are riots everywhere. The lines on a map that we know aren't actually yet formed. Everything is still happening. So the urge to centralize power will obviously be there. That is one contingency. But another one that I got far better insight on from your book is the contingency of time and politics, which forces them, instead of starting anew and framing something from scratch, of just taking the Government of India Act 1935 and saying that this will be the broad structure and we will base everything on this, and essentially like copy pasting almost 2/3 of that, I think, for the draft constitution.
And for the first draft, I think ultimately it was a little less than 1/3.
Yeah, for the first draft, and kind of beginning with that, and therefore automatically, because that is designed by a colonial state to rule the people and to protect the state from the people and not the other way around, you kind of end up with that. So and also there is all the politics happening with the Muslim League weighing, and people are sort of trying to avoid partition at the same time. All kinds of things are going on. So give me a sort of a sense of, in a sense, a mahal of the time, because the important thing to note is that, like you stated, like I keep saying, you cannot judge these people on hindsight. They are in that cauldron where so many things are happening, around them. Give me a sense of what's happening inside the cauldron, and what are all the different imperatives and what are the directions that they're being driven in.
So it's December 9th, 1946, the first day that the Constituent Assembly is meeting in the Central Hall of Parliament. It's a heady occasion. And before Rajendra Prasad gets elected, they get Sachidananda Sinha, who's the oldest member of the Constituent Assembly, to make the inaugural speech. And this inaugural speech that is made is essentially one that is quite revealing of how the Constituent Assembly sees its job. It sees its job as taking the best of constitutions that have already been prevalent in Europe for a couple of centuries and making it work from India. It is littered with literary quotes from several authors, all in English, and has a great sense that now this is India's time to be on the world stage, and the way it is going to be on the world stage is like everyone else is on the world stage, with a classic Anglo-American model of a constitution. This is the vision that is set out by Sachidananda Sinha on the 9th of December 1946. The man that's chosen to execute the vision is Benegal Narsingh Rao. He is the constitutional advisor, a fine man of great erudition and learning. He has been a High Court judge, he was an ICS officer, and he had been given the task of harmonizing the Government of India Act 1935, which was a kind of constitutional statute because it kind of was setting out what government in India is going to be like and the division of powers between the union and the provinces. And he has to harmonize that statute with 1,500 odd other laws that exist in the country. So Rao is chosen to do this task. He has great knowledge and networks abroad. So that he will give us the best constitution that we can have, that gives us this glorious place in the pantheon of nations in the world. Now, how does Rao go about this task? And this is something that actually my experience in Vidhi also made amply clear, is that everyone wants a base draft to begin commenting. It's producing that base draft that is hard. But Rao already had a base draft. The base draft was the Government of India Act, which was a statute for government formation. And let's be clear on one aspect. The Government of India Act has a lot of criticism because it doesn't have fundamental rights and so on. I mean, the basic impulse of the colonial government, while maintaining law and order was key, was also to ensure a largely liberal state. I mean, it was not a state that was essentially looking to stamp its authority at every nook and corner. It wanted to have the optics of ensuring a basic degree of liberalism in the colonies, in keeping with the white man's burden of civilizing the natives. So the Government of India Act essentially set out what the British thought was the foundation of self-government in India. So you had, for the first time, elected legislative assemblies in first 6 provinces, and then it became 8 or 9 provinces. I forget the total number of provinces. And then you had government at the center, which had a governor general, and you had a range of provisions on how the center and states are going to work with each other. So the Government of India Act exists. Rao takes the Government of India Act as the first draft. He goes around the world on a tour. He goes to Ireland. He meets Eamon de Valera. He goes to the US, has discussions with Justice Frankfurter, several people in Washington D.C. He studies the Constitution of Japan. He looks at Malaysia, Switzerland. He's looked at all kinds of constitutions, and he produces a questionnaire. He produces a questionnaire which is circulated to all members of the Constituent Assembly, which is kind of the fundamental questions on what kind of government India should have. So there's a question, for example, on should India have A, a presidential form of government like the US, B, cantons and a federation like Switzerland, so C, constitutional monarchy like the UK. So there is like a menu of choices that is presented to every member of the Constituent Assembly. And it seems that this menu itself is derived from the standard playbook of A, what the Government of India Act has, and B, what other countries in the world have. And it seems that the members of the Constituent Assembly have to basically tick their choices, and they can provide some reasons should they want to. So it is because of the fact that there is already a draft present that the Constituent Assembly goes to that draft. And that's also because of the contingency of time. We want a constitution quickly. India is independent. The Government of India Act and the Indian Independence Act is still governing the nation. We want something to essentially take its place. And so you want to do something quickly. So these are the 2 reasons as to why we go to the Government of India Act. As far as partition is concerned, yes, partition does have a heavy influence on the minds of the Constituent Assembly in 2 ways. The first is that law and order becomes a primary concern. So even if their liberal impulses might have gone towards more rights for individuals, those get tempered in favor of creating a larger and larger law and order state. The second is that partition ensures that we can throw the cabinet mission plan out of the window. The cabinet mission plan, if you remember, had this complicated scheme of federation where there were going to be provinces, then provinces would be in groups, and groups would ultimately lead to the union government. The union government would have very few powers: foreign affairs, defense, communications. Most of them would be at provincial and group level. So India would look much more bottom up. And this was a concession being made to the Muslim League. But the moment partition gets announced, the cabinet mission's plan of federation gets thrown out. And there is almost an immediate reversion into for what we call quasi-federal, but which is essentially a unitary government with some federal characteristics. And that's what partition makes us do. But I also don't want to overstate the importance of partition for the constitution we have. I think the essential impulses shared largely across the board in the Constituent Assembly. There were some exceptions like Minu Masani and the Libertarians, very few, and Hasrat Mohani and some hard-nosed communists who were there. But largely, the impulses that were shared was that we want a constitution that is based on an Anglo-American model, because that is what a liberal constitution of the time looks like. Now, we have certain needs in India for a state which will be the guarantor of liberty, because there is this sense that Indians look at the state as the Mai Baap Sarkar. So we want the state now to guarantee liberty. So we are now going to invest more powers in the state, particularly when it comes to law and order and when it comes to economic planning. So these are the two kinds of changes in that sense that we bring about: a much stronger state with more police powers than the other constitutions that we are surveying, and a state that has an economic ideology, which is again a novel idea, but we think that we need that because the state has to be the kind of guarantor of your economic well-being. So I think this is what the cauldron looks like, and Ambedkar is the person to essentially shepherd this, or if you were to use the cauldron example, we will coral this fire into something that is meaningful and doesn't burn the place down. Though he does say later that I don't like the constitution, we must burn it out. And just on that point, actually, what you were saying about Chandrapan Prasad ji was actually very meaningful, because there's a kind of interesting inversion that happens with Ambedkar in the 50s, when he's of course talking about this large state and how it needs to guarantee liberty, but very quickly he switches, right? He's become law minister, but he's quickly disillusioned by what this state is doing, and that it's really not driving the reform that it should. He resigns over the Hindu Code Bill and how it was watered down over a period of time, and the state is not driving the kind of social reform that it could. And he, in a sense, and particularly his conversion to Buddhism and his sort of move to society and the community, becomes quite Gandhian. This is a kind of classic Gandhian act, right? As in, you kind of giving up, and in this public spectacle, as in you are now embracing a new religion. I mean, this is exactly the opposite of what Ambedkar would have been 20 years back, and that's actually the sign of a great intellectual, someone who's willing to change his views over time. So I think there's a lot of interesting things at play in the cauldron in the late 40s and early 50s.
And in a sense, I think there is one fundamental reality which both Gandhi and Ambedkar recognized, so they tackled it in different ways, which was when, Ambedkar spoke of villages as a den of localism, etc., or when he said the constitution is just a topsoil, there is a recognition there, or constitutional values are just a topsoil. There is a recognition there that society is deeply illiberal and we need to do something about it. And the circa 1947 to 50 Ambedkar's way was, let's put these powers in the constitution, let's try to change it from the top down, whereas Gandhi's whole thing was, let's try to change it from the bottom up. And perhaps there is a crowding out of the effort towards liberalism after the constitution comes into being, because many people seem to think that we've done the job with this constitution, and social change from the grassroots is just not such an urgent need. And today, with hindsight, we can look back and say that that was a liberal failure. The other thing that sort of strikes me, and again, there's a human aspect to it which fascinates me. Like when the Government of India Act comes out, after it comes out, Nehru, in his presidential speech at the Lucknow session of the Congress in 1936, calls the act a new charter of slavery. In the same session, Rajendra Prasad denounces the act as one that, quote, in no way represents the will of the nation, is designed to facilitate and perpetuate the domination and exploitation of the people of India, stop quote. And Madan Mohan Malviya says, quote, not only does the Government of India Act not give us freedom, it takes away what little freedom we have, stop quote. And all these quotes are from your book, obviously. And later on, you find when our draft constitution is presented, there are similar reactions coming from within us. Hasrat Mohani describes it as a Pandora's box. Damodar Seth says that, instead of a new ideal constitution, what we've got is an intelligent framed copy, some others along with him. And, they move resolutions and whatever. Later on in time, Somnath Lahiri says it's written from the point of view of a police constable. So clearly, all of these people are seeing it clearly. But there is also a sense that very tragically and poignantly, some of these main figures who were protesting the GOI Act of 1935 are not protesting those same features in this constitution, because somehow they made the assumption that the problem was getting rid of the British. They were oppressing us. This was a tool. Now that we are in charge, it is okay. It is no longer a tool for oppression, though of course it remained a tool for oppression. So what is your sense on these sort of human tragedies? Because too often a mistake that people make is a look back on history, and historical figures are are, it's like, they are a particular thing, they are fixed in space and time. But these are human beings struggling with various problems. They are responding to their own incentives. There's that famous saying about, where we stand depends on where we sit. And these guys are sitting in a very different place right now. So what is sort of your sense of all of that is happening, and the human failings and the way they are going back and forth across positions through all of this?
I actually think that the transition between the views that the framers had about the Government of India Act and how they are about the Constitution is quite remarkable, because some of that transition is expected, because the fact is that different times call for different reactions, and at that point of time it was the freedom movement. We were asking for Purna Swaraj, and we got some crumbs of Purna Swaraj or crumbs of no Swaraj at all. So obviously there was going to be virulent protests. You wouldn't think what would happen 10 years later. They are not soothsayers. Okay, so I can totally understand why they denounced the Government of India Act at that time. It was simply not what we were looking for. Now, when it comes to the Constitution itself, the fact is that we have made two key changes from the Government of India Act, which we think is going to work. One is that we have provided for universal adult suffrage, and I think this is big, and we must credit the framers of the Constitution that there was no discussion on franchise being restricted on grounds of property or gender or any of those things, which is quite remarkable. And the second is that we've also provided for fundamental rights, which is something that the Government of India Act didn't have, which the courts, actually British courts, somehow brought in incrementally. So we made these two changes, and we've of course got this heady feeling of optimism that now we are going to do right by our countrymen and countrywomen. And so they think that, okay, I mean, those criticisms of the Government of India Act don't stand as much. While in that sense it's understandable, the reason why I say it's remarkable is that there is a fundamental tension in what has been drafted. And this tension is as follows. Is that we want, as Ambedkar has said, that we want the individual to be the unit on which the Constitution is based. And so we've created these fundamental rights, the standard liberal fare everywhere. But we also have this very ambitious program of economic planning, which we have taken to the level of putting it in the Constitution itself. Now, mind you, this is actually, as I said, a fairly original step, because constitutions are about setting political structures. They are not really about setting economic structures, because there's a recognition that economic structures could change over time in terms of what you want and what you think is for the greater good of mankind. But the Constitution marks a clear departure from that, because at that point of time, the dominant sentiment is that a socialist state with centralized planning is the way forward. Now, fundamentally, that impulse, while intended well, is an illiberal impulse. It comes through most clearly within 2 years of the Constitution in the Zamindari Abolition Act cases. Because you've got a Constitution which has got the right to property on the one hand, which is giving us a fundamental right to every individual. But at the same time, the same parliament which has drafted the Constitution is now passing Zamindari, and state governments actually are passing Zamindari abolition legislations everywhere, which is directly and frontally assaulting the right to property. Now, this is a fundamental tension. And somewhere maybe our thinking about that, about the middle path, makes us believe that there is always some straddling of the two extremes that is possible. But conceptually, this tension remains. And I think that is what I find remarkable, that you cannot transpose something onto a structure that is fundamentally not liberal, or vice versa. So if you wanted economic planning and you thought that was the way forward, then perhaps your fundamental rights chapter should have been different. If you genuinely felt that, we want community over individual, then essentially that's what you should have done. Or if you felt that fundamental rights were so critical, then maybe the balance would have been struck a little bit this way. I'm not saying that you have to take only one extreme and stick to it, but I feel that there ought to have been some better resolution of this conceptual tension that existed. But I don't think there was. And I think one of the reasons why there wasn't is because the job of drafting the Constitution was was left to the lawyers. So it became a kind of technocratic exercise, whereas these big questions, which would be answered by politicians, the politicians were busy running the country. There was partition, there was Kashmir, there were all kinds of issues that they had to deal with. Nehru was Prime Minister, Patel was Home Minister, Azad was Education Minister, and everybody was essentially running government. So the task of drafting the constitution was left to the lawyers. So you get this kind of wordsmithing that happens, which is how you try to resolve this tension. Oh, directive principles are not binding, and you have this kind of language. But that's why that is a tension that existed conceptually, and over time has been resolved by ensuring that the directive principles are basically essentially now shibboleth.
So, what was the evolution of the constitution like from the period that, Rao sends out the questionnaire, people respond to that, then you have the Constituent Assembly, you have the first draft constitution, and so on all the way to the final constitution. Give me a sense of the sort of negotiations and arguments that are happening, because even here there are sort of all kinds of arguments and disagreements about, the design of the state itself.
Yeah. So Rao first, as I said, circulates a questionnaire. On the basis of the questionnaire, he has a first draft. This draft is in place in 1947, around July to August 1947. He has this draft. So obviously, a lot of the work has happened beforehand. Now, once this draft is in place, there are several committees that have been set up of the Constituent Assembly. There is a committee that is looking at powers of the union government in the Union Powers Committee. There's a committee that's looking at the power of provincial governments. There's a committee on fundamental rights. There is a committee on tribal and excluded areas. So there are several committees, Financial Powers Committee, and so on. Now, all these committees are coming up with reports. Now, these reports have to be translated into draft text. So, for that, there is a committee that is set up called the Drafting Committee. Now, Ambedkar is made chairperson of this Drafting Committee, and there are 7 people, most of whom are lawyers. I mean, and in the beginning, they were all lawyers. Then one died and was replaced by T.T. Krishnamachari, who was a well-known economist. And then you have this drafting committee that essentially has this task of putting together these reports and editing and revising Rao's text to make it the second draft of the constitution. This is what they do. They've done this towards the end of 1947. And then there is a draft version of the constitution that is circulated to all members of the Constituent Assembly. Then there are debates in the Constituent Assembly in 1948 where every member pipes in on various issues. I'll deal with this process first. And then the drafting committee takes all those suggestions, works on it for a year, a little more than a year. Then in 1949, comes up with a final draft, which again the members comment on. Some changes are made, most changes are rejected. And then on 26th of November 1949, we finally adopt and enact the constitution, which comes into force on 26th of January, because it's going to be celebrated as Republic Day, because it was earlier celebrated as Purna Swaraj Day. So that is why we wait for those 2 months and we celebrate 26th January as the day on which the constitution comes into force. So this is as far as the process is concerned. As far as the substantive views are concerned, as I said earlier, once you have a first draft, people are only going to tinker at the edges. So there is no substantial change in terms of, let's not have a government that is top down, let's have a government that is bottom up, let's have more powers of federation, let's not think about directive principles as non-binding, let's have them as binding principles. So I don't think there are conceptually first order questions that are discussed at this stage. So most of the changes are changes in relation to particular articles of the Constitution. So, for example, the longest debate in the Constituent Assembly is on the question of language. And this vexed question of English, Hindi, vernacular, what is this formula going to be? That's a very long debate where we ultimately end up with a hedge, right? You say that English is the official language. Hindi will also be used. In 15 years, this will be reviewed and states will be allowed to do their own thing. So you have this kind of hedge where and this is a kind of pattern that you see in a lot of these vexed questions, that you leave it to Parliament to decide. There are a lot of questions which are left to Parliament by law. So fundamental changes are not made because there is a view, consistent view across the board largely, that India needs a large state that is based on separation of powers. So we follow the British model where there is a executive that is wholly within the legislature. The leader of the majority party becomes the legislature, becomes the prime minister, and there is a judiciary that is independent. Here we make a distinction because it's independent both in structure as well as in practice, unlike the UK, where it is at that point of time a committee of the House of Lords is actually the judicial wing. So this is the structure that we have, and I feel that while it's the safe option, so if you have a bunch of lawyers, the lawyers will take an option of this. It's tried and tested. It's got its precedents. You're not doing something radically new. But there are some questions which you think, not just in hindsight, but maybe even at that point of time, you perhaps could ask: do we need a totem president? Why do we need that? Why do we need such a huge Rashtrapati Bhavan, the largest presidential estate anywhere in the world, if this person is not going to have any powers and is only going to perform a ceremonial role? Do we really need that? I don't know. That's certainly a question that comes up. I mean, again, as in if you're looking at this idea of majority parties, I mean the idea of the prime minister being the leader of the majority party, and we obviously have this culture of a Mai Baap Sarkar where you're essentially looking at some kind of vestige of feudal rule, then perhaps maybe a presidential system is more suited to who we are. But some of these fundamental questions don't really get asked as much. And I think that's because we are in a hurry. We need to get the best document we can. We have the example of Pakistan, which doesn't get a constitution for about 10 years, and the army comes in, and there's all kinds of examples. So we are always like, we don't want to be that. And so we get the best of what we can in 3 years' time. And it was a remarkable feat that they did it in 3 years. And I think it's time for every generation to see whether that what they did in 3 years continues to work for them or not.
Yeah, and some of it is truly remarkable, like what you pointed out about universal adult suffrage, which we can take for granted, but it was completely radical then. In other nations, the fight for it took decades, and we just got it right away, and that's amazing. Now, you've described the process through which we arrived at this and some of the tensions and some of the arguments. And, when you then speak about early in your book, you describe about why you're calling it a colonial constitution. You give two reasons. One, of course, is how much of it borrows from the Government of India Act 1935. 2/3 of the first draft, around 1/3 of the final constitution itself. But more than that, the basic spirit that it takes. Your second, reasoning is a conceptual sense where you say, quote, but the Indian constitution is colonial in a more conceptual sense. It sets up a government that towers over the citizen, much like colonial governments tend to do, stop quote. Various examples of that. We've discussed the dilution of the fundamental rights. I in fact had an excellent episode with Shruti Rajgopalan about the right of property alone, about what happened to that through the ages. I've written plenty about how the right to free speech is so badly sort of diluted. In your book, you've spoken about preventive detention, which, I mean, when the Rowlatt Act happened, which, where the British brought in preventive detention, we were rightly up in arms against it. And yet, Ambedkar was actually the swing vote for it, as you point out, when the debate was happening, and that's why we got it. And the salt tax, Gandhi's whole Dandi March was, hey, the salt tax is unjust, but it kind of remained. In fact, I think a few years back, I wrote a column about how this was before GST, about how now it's greater than ever, much greater than what Gandhi protested against. I'm not sure how much it is today with GST coming into play.
It was the salt cess that we had, and the Indian Salt Service with headquarters in Jaipur.
I love that name.
With
the
Indian Salt Service, 11 officers headquartered in Jaipur administering the salt cess.
So give me a broader sense of the ways in which the constitution was colonial in this sense. The sense, fine, the borrowing sense, fine, we got that. But in this particular sense, because For many people, partly because it is so large and unwieldy a document, unlike the American Constitution, which is concise and just so brilliantly pithy. The largeness of our Constitution also makes it a little bit like Ambedkar Gandhi, right? You can look inside and find whatever the hell you want. So you'll find many beautiful things in our Constitution, but you'll also find a lot that is just an artifact that was already an artifact by that time and should never have been there. So give me a sense of all the ways in which it is conceptual, and the way that it functions, and the way that it designs a state.
I'll give you three reasons as to why it's colonial, breaking down the reason that I've given in the book. The first is, why is it so long? We used to be told in our civics textbooks that we have the longest constitution in the world. I never knew whether to laugh or to cry or feel proud or to feel sad. It basically meant that we had more articles to mug up at that point of time. That's what it entailed. But it was somewhere said in a way that we should feel proud. Right, that was the way in which it was said. We have the longest constitution in the world. We are the largest democracy in the world. There is a kind of underlying pride with which we say these things. But why is it long? And what does it have to do with being colonial? I think there is a very clear reason, and I give this example in some of the talks that I've done on this. But why is the constitution so long? You took the example of salt earlier. And when salt was being discussed, and that we should have a provision saying that there should be no salt tax in India, someone said it was a sentimental provision. Someone else said, rightly so, that salt is a particular item. Constitutions don't describe particular items. Fair enough. But when it came to another item, jute, not only was it discussed, but there is a provision in the Constitution from the original Constitution, which continues till today, called Article 273. What does it say? It says that when jute is exported from the country, the customs duty that we get on that export will be shared as grants in aid with the three states of West Bengal, Odisha and Bihar. Okay. Now, I come from West Bengal, and of course, jute was an important item then. But is it important enough to be in the Constitution? I mean, surely what is good for salt, which is the singular emblem of our freedom movement, should also be good for jute. That it's also another item of commerce. People will work it out. But there is a reason why it's not left for people to work out. And that's because there is a fundamental distrust of what a people who are not accustomed to democracy will do, which is why you have law to negotiate that for you. So this is, in my view, nothing but a perpetuation of the colonial sentiment that the natives cannot be trusted. Now, you can't say natives cannot be trusted. You say that India is not ready for democracy yet. So, because what essentially are you doing? You're essentially saying that the state of West Bengal, Bihar and Odisha will not be able to negotiate successfully with each other and the union to share these proceeds. So let me write it down in the Constitution. So what you're essentially doing is distrusting elected representatives, and that is a distrust of democracy. And that, in my view, is clearly a colonial holdover that you don't think that the people can sort it out. And this is a view that continues in various forms to the present day, that I trust the union government more than the state, I trust state more than my local councillor. This kind of sentiment still exists. So that's the first reason that I think there is, while we were setting up a democratic state, there is still a fundamental distrust of the people. And ultimately, this is something that Gandhian philosophy and thought allows, because this was the genius of Gandhi, that when he took over from the moderates and the extremists and the early Congress, he allowed the creation of a movement where the people were mobilized but didn't really participate. They participated in the freedom movement for sure, but not in the way in which the state was being structured or created. And that was the genius of Gandhi, that it was a mass movement, but the people still remained. And when it came to the Constitution, people still remained subjects in some sense and not citizens. The second reason as to why it's colonial is because we perpetuated colonial institutions. And there's a lot of writing on this, that for purely practical reasons, we continued the police service, we continued the Indian administrative service, we renamed all of it, of course, from the Imperial Police Service, but we continued that. And not only did we continue it, we also continued it without reforming it in any way. There were no new incentives for policemen to behave differently. The Indian Police Act 1861 still continued. There was no retraining of policemen done. Of course, we didn't have that many resources, so it was not as if there was significant investment of resources that was made. So it was almost as if overnight these people who were brutalizing serving Indians is now going to start serving Indians, right? So that's the second reason, and it's sort of a institutional reform was not something that we thought about very seriously. Again, part of that heady optimism of that time, and I think that was the second. And the third, which is the fundamental point of what does it mean to have a state that's towering over the citizen. I think that was a deliberate design choice that was made by the framers of the assembly, that at this point of time, if too much power devolves to the citizen, then what you have is essentially citizens who are not ready for democracy. God knows what they will select. So I talk about the constitution of the Hindustan Free State, which was a constitution that was drafted by the Hindu Mahasabha. And there were two interesting provisions there, which were provisions for referendum and recall. So you can have referendum on key issues, and you can recall elected participants, which had made a comeback during the Anna Hazare movement, which was one of the key demands of the Anna Hazare movement, that you have the right to recall. But these were summarily dismissed. There was no question of including them in the constitution because, again, coming back to the same thought that people are not yet ready for democracy, and if they are, then this will happen at that time. And a state towering over the citizen is the reason as to why you have what you mentioned, the preventive detention laws. And this actually strikes me as shocking. And I think anyone who even talks about fundamental rights as a single achievement of the Constitution has a hard time explaining what a provision legitimizing preventive detention is doing there, right? Because it's right in the heart of the fundamental rights chapter as Article 22. And Ambedkar voted in favor of it, as did Madhav Rao. Only K. Munshi voted against it. As Mahavir Tyagi famously said, that it's because they are lawyers and have never been to jail. And Munshi had been to jail. That is why they continue to vote in favor of it. But the point is this: Ambedkar thought that, one, we need a state that guarantees our liberty. Preventive detention is going to happen anyway. So if it happens, might as well regulate the state rather than let it happen anyway. Perhaps it's a reasonable thought, but you think that at some point of time when you're drafting a constitution, because a constitutional moment doesn't happen every day. So when you get a constitutional moment, as in you think that some kind of idealism will prevail, and you will say you will have a simple provision: preventive detention shall not be permitted, full stop. Or a provision that there shall be free speech, full stop. We did have a provision like this. It's not as if this is without precedent. We had untouchability. Untouchability shall be abolished. So we knew how to draft provisions like this. So maybe some part of that idealism could also have filtered through when it came to matters around preventive detention. But it did, because we wanted law and order. And that is why I think that this idea that man is vile and it's only our future generations that have failed us cannot explain things exclusively. It's also because some of this has sanction in the constitution itself. So not a single government in independent India has touched the law on sedition. Not a single government in independent India has done anything about preventive detention. And we don't need to see this as we tend to do today through Modi tinted glasses, right? This is about the BJP versus the Congress. This is about the state and the citizen. And this is the point that I've been trying to make in the book. Because the real impulse for writing this book came, and I write in the epilogue, during the first wave of COVID. There was this photograph of 50 migrant laborers crouched on the side of the road in Bareilly. And they were sitting down on their haunches, and some state officials were spraying them with disinfectant. For me, that photograph really captured what the Indian state was about. The state was still towering above with the chemical spray, and the citizens were still sitting below as if they were subjects waiting for some benefaction. And I think that is, to put it very plainly, a state that the successive governments have inherited, but the constitution has created.
I often say that, India has three problems today in my view, and not everyone may agree with the first of those. And the first of those is the party in power right now. And of course, I oppose them, and other people may support them, and that's subjective. But the second and the third, I think, are pretty undeniable. And at least the conditions are, whether you worry about them may or may not be. And one condition is the oppressive state, exactly what you described, that for all these decades, we've had a state that has ruled us rather than served us under every single party. And Shruti Rajgopalan has a great talk on YouTube, which I'll link from the show notes, where she says that right from Nehru onwards, every prime minister who wanted to do something unconstitutional amended the constitution and made it constitutional first. So to the extent that I think there are more than 100 amendments, to the extent that there's even this cartoon where somebody goes to the parliament bookshop and he asks for the constitution, and the person says, "This is a bookshop, sir. We don't have periodicals." So,
it reminds me of what Acharya Kriplani had also said, because Acharya Kriplani had lived almost till 100, and someone had remarked saying that, "Acharya Sahab, you have a very good constitution." He said, "What constitution? It's only amendments."
Yeah, it's almost like a constitution of Theseus, like you have the ship of Theseus.
But is it the same constitution anymore?
Yeah.
And that was actually seen as one of its signal virtues. As an Ambedkar kept saying that, yes, we have a long constitution, but we've also made amending power very easy. Now, this is a compromise that I actually find as a double-edged sword. I mean, it does have something going for it in the sense that future generations can make of them what you will. But I mean, left to myself, as in I would have thought that a more sensible design choice would have been a shorter constitution with something very fundamental to who we think we are as a people. Leave the rest to legislation and make this hard to amend. This is what I would think is a way of drafting an accessible constitution that truly speaks to the nation. But the moment we saw this not just as a constitution that is speaking to the nation as a system of, as a charter of values, but also as a detailed delineation of structures of government, I mean, then it becomes a constitution plus statute rolled into one. And that's what I think we have.
Yeah, and to complete my thought, the third of the problems which is not relevant to our conversation at all today is our fractured society and etc. etc. But that's not relevant. Now, the question I want to ask is that let us say that we begin with the GOI Act of 1935, but you want to, move away from it in certain ways. The way in which I would like to move away from it, from where I sit and where I stand, is that I would like there to be more liberty. So basically, the state gets much less oppressive, and you have safeguards that protect the citizen from the state and not the other way around. But instead, there is a third direction that the Indian state moves in, which is in the direction of sort of redefining liberties to include positive liberties. Isaiah Berlin had this, negative liberties and positive liberties. Just to kind of simplify it for my listeners who may not have heard of the concept, negative rights basically are rights where somebody cannot do something to you. So someone cannot take your life, not infringe your right to free speech, not take your property, which is why they're called negative rights. You are protected from those. And positive rights are when someone has to give you something. Someone has to give you food, someone has to give you job, someone has to give you broadband. And it's dangerous to even think of them as rights. They're more like entitlements. And the problem is that when you muddy the language and you bring them all together, to fulfill a positive right, you have to infringe a negative right. If you want to give somebody free broadband, you have to get that money from somewhere, and therefore you're using coercion and your monopoly on violence. So just, for the listener's sake, since I was using jargon, and in our constitution, thankfully, the fundamental rights are all sort of negative rights, more or less. And all the positive rights like khana do, ye karo, wo karo, all that is in the directive principles, which eventually no one really takes seriously and no one cares about what is in there. Now, right from the start of the whole framing process, there was this sense that the state will intervene to actually offer many of these positive rights, because the argument, like in your words, you've written, contrary to the widely accepted liberal understanding that non-intervention by the state would mean the perpetuation of liberty, Rao proposed the opposite. Liberty would only be meaningful when the state actively intervened to secure a decent life for all, stop quote. And at one level, it seems to make sense. Like, what are you going to do with the right to free speech if you don't have food on your plate? But I would argue that while they were thinking correctly of the ends, they got the means all wrong. The way to get there is through freedom. That is the only way, in fact, to get there, as history has taught us. But those lessons weren't, as clear at that point in time, at that moment in time. So what is your sense of this? That the one significant way in which we departed from the 1935 Government of India Act, in my naive reading, so please correct me if I'm wrong, is that we became much more paternalistic in this sense that, number one, we tried to build, different aspects of a welfare state when we were really too poor to be able to actually, carry it out. And number two, we tried to change society from the top down because of all the ills of society and because of this fatal conceit that we can sit here and we can direct what society will be and it will change immediately, which with hindsight was folly, because politics has today caught up with society and it is what it is. And the real work of change had to happen at the grassroots, and we utterly failed there.
Yeah, so I agree with both of these things. I think the second one actually is a holdover of colonial thought that, we can sit in Delhi and we can change the way in which our villages function because we have this enlightened bureaucracy which knows everything. And this is exactly the idea of an impartial technocratic administrator who can sit and solve the problems of the country. We inherited that and we continued it. And that is, I would say, a continuation of what was before. The welfare state was certainly a break from the past. And there is no doubt about the fact that this was the first time that the state was taking on the responsibilities of securing a better life for citizens. And this is a noble goal and a goal that the state ought to have sought. But again, where I find actually the muddying of the waters is that we have a lot of rhetoric in the Constituent Assembly about how important health and education are to the future of the Indian nation. And I think they got that diagnosis perfectly right. But if it was so important, why was the discussion around health and education a discussion about whether to make these rights justiciable or not? That seems to me like a very lawyerly and technical discussion to have. As in, if we think that our life expectancy currently, which it was at that point of time, was about 28 for women and 31 for men. I mean, we get
low.
Yeah, it was very low. It was very low, very low. I'm getting the numbers slightly wrong, but it's around that region. It's around there. Given that it was around there, shouldn't the questions that we be asking are, even at the level of a constitution, that how are we going to resource better healthcare in our country? Right? If getting life expectancy up is a serious goal, and if this is what we think is critical to the future welfare of our nation, why don't we have a whole chapter on healthcare in our constitution? Why don't we have a whole chapter on education? Whether you want the state to do it or you want someone else to do it, that's a different matter. But why don't you deal with these questions with the attention that you yourself think that it deserves? Why is it relegated to a question on whether someone should be allowed to go to court if they have not got it? I mean, that seems to be an extremely narrow pigeonholing of a very large and critical problem. And I think that this happens because the language that we are speaking at that point of time, though our thoughts have gone towards a welfare state and what a post-colonial order looks like, the language that we are speaking is still that of a colonial administrator. So Sengupta Dasgupta has this very nice essay in Udit Bhatia's book, which is how the constitution is drafted from the point of view of an anxious administrator. Okay? And I think he's right on that, because the fact is that the language that you see is careful, guarded, full of caveats. Where we are talking about education, we want everyone to be educated. We think we don't have the resources. So what do? We say that everyone shall have the right to have education and the state shall provide it in 10 years' time. The state shall provide free and compulsory education to all within 10 years. This is a directive principle that we set ourselves in 1945 and 1950. Now the question is, if it is that important, surely we can think more as to how will we get there. And I think that is also a discussion that the Constituent Assembly, either as the Constituent Assembly or as the first Parliament, should be having. And just because these questions are not so-called constitutional is not a reason to not be having them. I mean, because what is constitutional or not is defined by us. We don't have to be followers in this respect. So I think that's so we're continuing to speak the language of the colonial administrator. And this is where I think that a thesis like my friend Madhav's thesis that the Constitution is India's founding moment is fundamentally wrong. Because I think that gives the impression that the Constitution has come out of the ether, out of nowhere, and has created this magnificent country. And maybe we were classmates in school, and maybe in college, and maybe he took our history teacher's lesson too seriously that India as a nation began in 1947. Because a Constitution, as you see, I would say in large respect, it's a continuity constitution. It continues what was there before, makes some changes here and there, and continues it. Maybe it's a good thing. It's a reasonable choice to have been made. But as Sandipto says, which I think is closer to the truth, that it is neither a break nor a continuity. It's somewhere in between. It's a break in some places. It continues some things in some places. But what it's not is that it's most certainly not the founding moment of India. I mean, in a factual way it is. I mean, in the sense that it's the founding moment of a sovereign democratic republic, sure. But that's not the way in which it is meant in the title. It meant that it somehow constituted the country and constituted the people. And I don't think it has done that, because if it were to be that, then I would think that there had to be far more in the constitution around issues that mattered to the Indian people at that point of time, which the Constituent Assembly themselves recognized, primary of which were health and education. And there would be far less on things that didn't matter, that is, differences between finance bills and money bills and how appropriation bills will be presented in the House, which were all stuff that is really jargon of the kind that could be delegated to some statute.
I mean, I agree with you on the fact that the constitution should have never have mentioned salt or jute because they're too particular and you want to leave them to the messy democratic processes. And I would actually say the same for education. Like, I think if the constitution said something about education at the time, it would have been empty virtue signaling. It did not have the means to actually deliver any of it. And the only way to deliver it was to enable a free society in which people can move towards that themselves. I mean, we were too poor at that time to do any kind of welfareism, and we failed at whatever top-down interventions we tried
so
to
I
do.
think there are two ways that I would answer this. First is that I fully agree with the premise that the only way to getting certain outcomes is by ensuring that we have the freedoms to get there. And we may not have it tomorrow, we may not have it overnight, but we will ultimately get there if we set the structures for it. Absolutely. But my other point is to question as to what is a constitution for. Because I believe, as I've written in the book, that it's not constitutions that make nations, but nations that make constitutions. And we were making a constitution for ourselves. So if we felt at that point of time that education was the most important thing and we had to achieve it as of yesterday, okay, then I would like to see a chapter dedicated to education in terms of how progressively over time we will ensure that there are resources to allow us to fund this education system. Now, whether it is a question of, it might ultimately have become a chapter on taxation. Okay, because it's ultimately a question of how you're going to get those resources in place. But I would have liked to see some thought in terms of the how we are going to get there. Whether it is just by keeping us free, or if you think it's not by keeping us free, but the state is going to do something about it, what will it do? How will it do it? Now, these are not things that you traditionally think of as constitutional, right? But I would think that if this was so important, and if we were marking a decisive break from the past, and if we were some kind of founding moment of a new Indian republic, then these kinds of new constitutional ideas should have made the cut.
I think, I mean, I agree with you that, nations make constitutions, but on that specific, I define it a little differently. I'd say the job of any constitution, the very basis is to protect the people from the state and to act as a safeguard for that, and also to lay down the conditions for prosperity. And the conditions for prosperity, I think, should not have involved specific thinking on specific subjects, but merely getting the constitutional values right. And we didn't get the fundamental constitutional value right of freedom. We absolutely
I
did
think
not.
certainly on freedom, and I think there is a key reason for that, is that we were also thinking about this dynamic entirely from the perspective in which Western theorists, whether it is primarily Mill actually saw it, which is the individual vis-a-vis the state. And I think while that's correct, and there's nothing wrong with looking at it like that, there was an important third component which we missed, which was that of the community. And I think the community does play a very critical role in society in India. And I think that as part of any constitutional thinking, we should have had a much more central focus on the idea of community. It comes in places. You can see this in the freedom of religion article, where there are some freedoms that are given to individuals and some freedoms that are given to groups. So there are, obviously, you will say, someone will say that caste-based reservations is also community coming in. So the community comes in certain ways, but I think that this relationship between the individual and the community is not a relationship that has been fully explored in the constitutional framework. And I think that we see shades of that quite often, as in whether you're talking about your Khap panchayats, whether you're talking about reservations, you're talking about entering Shabrimala. As in, you see this, I mean, the state is kind of very much a third player in this. It's very much the individual and the community, and I think this is a relationship that needed a little bit more thought, especially because you had Gandhi, who was hammering on about the fact that you don't want the state, you only want local communities, and Ambedkar saying that communities are oppressive. So I think I would have perhaps, if we were, as you said, if we were going to make a break from the GOI Act of 1935, then I think the idea of community needs to be taken much more seriously.
I feel that group rights and individual rights are always in conflict, and the negotiation between individuals and communities is something that can happen only at a social level without a constitution or a state getting involved. And the state's only role is really to protect the individual from the caprices of community. So you want to protect the individual from the Khap Panchayat, and as far as a Khap Panchayat as a democratically elected unit of governance is concerned, fine, that makes sense, as local as possible, but always while protecting individual rights, which to me is really the bedrock. But so tell me about the other visions of constitutions. You've mentioned a couple of them in this. What were the other visions of constitutionalism? One of them, of course, was from the Hindu Mahasabha, which you alluded to briefly. So give me a little bit about how those visions were sort of evolving and coming up, and what were they like? And, the Hindu Mahasabha one you said was also a colonial constitution.
Yeah, absolutely. As in, I think there was only one real alternative vision to what a constitution could look like, and that was one that was propounded by Gandhi. And like with many things that were Gandhian, Gandhi was both the biggest proponent and the biggest opponent of his own vision. Right, I'll get to that in a second. But the Hindu Mahasabha did come up with a constitution called the Constitution of the Hindustan Free State, as I write in my book. It's not a different constitution from the ultimate constitution of India. They knew that they were not doing this as a practical document to run the country, so they could put in a few more things there, which were perhaps not immediately achievable, right? Health, education, the facets of a welfare state. There was a whole litany of rights that they provide for, with a very similar structure of government to the rest of to what the constitution ultimately says. What was interesting to me for the Hindu Mahasabha's constitution is that they declared that India shall be a secular state with no state religion. It said that so that means there is no possibility of a constitutional Hindu Rashtra in that constitution. Second is that they said that the state shall not discriminate between any religion. So there could be no first class and second class citizenship amongst Hindus and Muslims. So I think that these were key, that they did do that, and they were speaking a very different, reasonable language. Because at the same time, you'll remember that Savarkar, under whose presidency the Hindu Mahasabha did come up with the constitution of the Hindustan Free State, had written the essentials of Hindutva, where he was saying that only a person who has his Pitra Bhumi and Punya Bhumi between the Indus and the Indian Ocean is a Hindu, and India belongs to Hindus. So you'd wonder that isn't this a contradiction of epic proportions, that here you're saying that India belongs to Hindus, excludes Muslims, Christians, and anyone who has their Pitra Bhumi and Punya Bhumi outside, but at the same time, when it comes to the constitution, you're singing a different tune, not only saying that there will be no discrimination, but also saying that there shall be no state religion and India shall be secular, something that the constitution of India doesn't say. Right? I mean, it's an interesting thought experiment that if we had the constitution of the Hindustan Free State, would it be a violation that the Prime Minister of India is going to do a Pran Pratishtha ceremony in Ayodhya? Maybe it would have been a violation of Savarkar's constitution, but it's certainly not a violation of the constitution of India. So I think that's an interesting thought experiment there. But the fact remains that the Hindu Mahasabha did this, which is a kind of trope that you see with the Sangh Parivar throughout independent India, under Vajpayee, certainly also under Modi, is that the language when it comes to the constitution is always a reasonable mainstream language, right? The Prime Minister also worships the constitution. He also says that he has great respect for it. There have been no frontal attacks on the constitution. The amendments to the constitution that this government has brought in have been amendments relating to the GST, economically backward caste reservations, not anything that you would think, at least openly and overtly, brings about any form of the Hindu Rashtra. Article 370 is a slight exception. I mean, it's kind of particular unique case, which we can get into, but is a different issue altogether. Because Hindutva as a doctrine can sit side by side with the constitution of the Hindustan Free State, because it's a doctrine that operates in society, and society operates at a different plane from constitutional law. And I think this is how the Hindu Mahasabha was seeing it at that time. This is how the BJP sees it now as well. And I think it's important so that we don't miss the wood for the trees, that, we have all this. There's a lot of talk that the constitution is in danger, and I'll stick my neck out to say that the constitution is not in danger. And I think that we need to, if you want to look at protecting the guardrails of our democracy, as you rightly said, we have to protect individuals from greater intrusion from the state, however and wherever it happens. I think that's got to be the focus. So the institutions have got to be our focus, not so much the constitution. So I find writing like this missing the wood for the trees a little bit. So that's the Hindu Mahasabha constitution. It's not really an alternative. It's kind of similar, but it's got these interesting features which perhaps are not the ones we would intuitively think exist in a constitution drafted by the Hindu Mahasabha. The only real alternative constitution that exists is the Gandhian one. Why is it an alternative? I think two reasons. It kind of goes against the traditional liberal conception of rights. It says that basically duties are fundamental. And channeling Krishna in the Mahabharata, he says the true source of rights is duty. So if you follow your duty, rights will ensue. So we don't need to, we can disregard this liberal consensus that rights and human rights because of who we exist are the fundamental basis for constitution. The fundamental basis should be duty. And the second is that an almost militant espousal of local self-government, that India should be congregation of village republics. Individuals should elect their panchayat. Panchayats should elect the taluka leaders. Talukas district state, and state the union with very few powers. So it was like bottom up and not top down. It was not fully worked out, particularly on economic matters, as I point out. I mean, how will this work? How will trade between villages work if everyone has different rules? There's horribly inefficient systems that you're going to set up. So it needed to be worked out a little bit better, but I think it was left at that level of ideology and principle. Shriman Narayan Agarwal, who later becomes the governor of Gujarat, does come up with a Gandhian constitution for free India. Gandhi writes the foreword for this constitution, but subtly distances himself from that and saying that it's a constitution that bears my name but doesn't mean that I agree with each of these. And why is it that Gandhi says that? It's not as if Gandhi is being duplicitous. Gandhi believes every word of what Agarwal has written, that India needs a bottom-up democracy. India needs a democracy that is based on the idea of rights. But he realizes that India is not ready for it. And for him, the constitution is a practical document that is meant to generate consensus. And the only way Jinnah and Nehru will see eye to eye together with all the other political leaders is that if we have a tried and tested constitutional model. And the tried and tested constitutional model is one that exists in Western countries, which both Nehru and Jinnah as lawyers are very familiar with. So he decides to quietly give this up. He says that India in its own time will find its own constitution, and he says that now I've turned my attention to society. So he embarks on a constructive program for moral uplift of individuals, because he says that that's what really is going to found a nation. But I think that without getting too caught up in the details of the Gandhian constitution, I think there are two broad trajectories for us to think about 75 years later. The first is what he called village republics, what we call decentralization. The 14th Finance Commission gave this devolution where it increased the share of states from 32% to 42%, greater power to states. We see that with the 73rd and 74th Amendment, creating a third tier. But we really haven't got there yet. So how do we try and ensure some meaningful decentralization that takes power closer to the people? I think that's one upshot of Gandhian thought that requires serious consideration today, not just by constitutional theorists, by economists, political theorists, political scientists. And the second, as far as this question of duty is concerned, this is an idea that keeps coming back, right, in political discourse, whether it's Indira Gandhi, the 42nd Amendment, or it's the Prime Minister Modi. Everyone keeps talking about the idea of duty because there is a deep kind of roots that this idea has in Indic thought, whether you're talking about dharma as the fundamental, more abstract notion of what is right conduct or duty, or about kartavya, which is kind of more in a transactional sense, what your duties are. But these are thoughts that keep recurring in political discourse. And I think the upshot of Gandhian thought on duty is that, can we think about a rights framework that can coexist with the idea of duties? And if so, what does it look like? I don't have the answer to this, but I think we have poo-pooed this idea of duty too much. And the greatest disservice to this idea was done by Indira Gandhi, who brought in fundamental duties as part of the most undemocratic 42nd Amendment to the Constitution in the emergency. So I think that's also kind of made it a concept that is again one on paper. But I do think that we need to think about duties in a way as to what are the duties that as citizens we owe each other. Whether that's in the constitution or not is a second order question. But what are those duties that we owe to each other? Because I don't think it would come as a surprise, and we are recording this in Delhi, that the civic duties that we owe each other, particularly in this city, is negligible, if not the rest of the country. So at the end of the day, if India is going to grow on the strength of individual enterprise and community will, then we have to know what it is that individuals owe each other.
I think from a point of view of personal morality and interpersonal behavior, duties are super important, and I think of them all the time. From a point of view of duties actually being part of the constitution, I think it is errant and dangerous nonsense. I think it's not a coincidence that our two most autocratic leaders are the two people who've spoken the most about it. And of course, Gandhi in his constitution also speaks about it. And also at one point when he speaks of his vision of economic organization is also quite alarming to me. You write, quote, there were also rules of economic organization, self-sustaining villages with khadi as a primary industry supported by other cottage industries like soap and matchmaking, a supplement to nationalized industries with constructive and non-violent labor unions, of cultivation of civic virtue by keeping one's villages clean, and of orienting education towards creating model villagers and citizens, stop quote. And it feels to me that again the multitude saying that, absolutely great political strategist and tactician and thinker and an absolute legend in many ways, but this is utterly daft to me. And I remember I did a couple of episodes on Gandhi with Ram Guha, and I quoted from Hind Swaraj where Gandhi rails against doctors and railways and so on, and I said that what's going on here, he doesn't seem to understand the world at all, but that one thing, ahimsa, non-violent resistance, he gets completely right and changes the world. How does he get that one thing right and nothing else, practically? And Ram's revealing answer was that is a one thing he has done. He actually has experience of it. He has lived it. He's had skin in the game. The other stuff, wo hawa mein baat kar raha hai. Not Ram's words, my words.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the sense I got with him. So it just felt that at some level he also must have known that let the actual hardcore practical people who've lived in this world sort of figure it out.
Yeah, and I think that it's essentially Gandhi sets himself up as providing a counterpoint to Western civilization, right? So in that sense, when he's talking about, whether he's talking about Swadeshi or he's talking about Ahimsa or he's talking about Satyagraha, as in what he's essentially doing is that he's trying to provide an alternative model to how the West sees civilization. And so when it comes to economic organization, as in this is something that, as you rightly said, he may have tried some little experiment in Tolstoy farm in South Africa, which worked very well because there were 20 people there who were kind of, some voluntarily, some corralled into doing this. But the fact remains that he has no idea as to how to do this at scale. But because this is a counterpoint to Western civilization and it has to provide an alternative that looks authentic, that looks original, that looks Indian, I mean, there is this alternative that is provided. And so how do we make sense of it? As Ram rightly said that, he hasn't done this, but also today, as in I think how we try to make sense of what he's saying is that we try and not take the letter of it. It makes no sense whatsoever to ever even think of any economic organization of this kind. But I think the idea really is, and this is how I choose to see it, that how do we empower individuals to be enterprising? I think this is ultimately how I see this Gandhian economic thought as relevant today. How can they do things that they think that they are good at, which will be good for themselves and will be good for the rest of society without excessive intervention of the state? This is how I see its relevance today.
Yeah, and that's actually a profound point, that we were talking about the Overton window earlier, and in a sense, Gandhi is perhaps moving the Overton window of Indicness and Westernness,
That's right.
and just providing the stark counterpoint, so at least you can begin to think in other directions. And on the fundamental question of decentralization, he is, and how change must happen bottom up, he's 100% right. I mean, we know that from hindsight, So I'll take you back to a question that you said your constitutional law professor asked you, which is that why is it that people between 1947 and 1950 get to decide the rules of the game by which we must live forever hence? And it's, we discussed Subhashish earlier. One of the points which he makes really well in his book is about how all our constitutions are contingent on the time they came about. So the American Constitution, their preoccupations at that time and their experiences drive them to make that constitution which people like me love so much and consider a model. And again, here we've discussed in detail what the contingencies were, and the Indian constitution ended up so overly centralized and flawed in so many ways. And I would agree with you that it is a colonial constitution. And is it that we must always depend on an accident of history ki constitution kab bana for the rules of the game to be changed? Or are there other ways of thinking about it? You can't also endlessly just petition for amendments all the time. What are the rules by which a society lives? And at some level, I think the rules by which a society lives will always come up through spontaneous order and through, the evolution of culture and society itself. And what a good constitution should do is just protect individual rights and let the rest happen within the political process of bargaining and negotiation and so on and so forth. But how do we think about constitutions? Like one bogey that is sometimes raised, and even voices on the Hindutva side have mentioned it, that hey, we have a crappy constitution, we should change it. Now I agree with them that constitution has many flaws. I would not like them to change it. I can some of the voices of today, especially those in government, are so strident in different ways that it horrifies me to think of what could come about. So how do we just think of this whole thing?
Yeah, so as in, this is the fundamental argument of my book, that the constitution is colonial, but that doesn't mean that we have a new one tomorrow. Okay, I mean, it's the two can sit side by side without any hint of irony. And how I think about constitutions is that, one, it must provide a fundamental set of values that we can agree on at this time. Okay, so if there are things that seem antiquated, seem like it don't make sense, then we need to get rid of them. And if there are other things that have come in and have become so central to our existence today, then I think it's time to put it in. So it has to speak to us as a nation and as a people. The second is that it must provide some degree of stability, because if it doesn't provide that degree of stability, then why have a constitution? Just have another law which says all this and then go ahead with it. So I would say that these are the two virtues of kind of, I would call the first one identity, and I would call the second one stability, as to who we are as a country and where we want to be. Now, taking this as the kind of anchor, usually there is a moment in historical time, as you said, where you get a constitutional moment. Typically, there are two kinds of these moments that have happened. One is that when a nation wins freedom, and the other is that when there is a overnight revolution. Okay, I mean, I draw the two as distinct, because India is a unique case where the nation wins freedom, but not in an overnight revolution, right? So it's happened over a long period of time, which is why tend not to get a radical break from the past, because usually these overnight freedom constitutions, you have all this heady stuff of the oath of the tennis court in Paris, where you're liberté, égalité, fraternité, and then you have the Russian Revolution, which is obviously a completely different kind of constitution that it has spawned, but it requires revolutionary moments of that kind to create decisive breaks from the past. Or you have a moment where the country has won independence after a long and hard-won freedom struggle, and then it has chosen a constitutional form that it feels it's true to it. And this is true for most African and Asian constitutions in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Because actually the number of constitutions, I may be getting this number a little bit wrong here and there, is that there were about 56 constitutions in the world in 1945 and 160 constitutions in 1975. Right, so this was the glory days of constitution making. And if you see what happened in that time, and this is not just India but across the board, largely African and Asian constitutions copied the form of government that existed in the mothership. So we had a kind of British form of government. If you see a lot of countries in the French colonies, in the Algeria, for example, as in Algeria, despite having its revolutionary war with France, creates a French system of presidency. But where they differ and these are three places where they differ, is one in the role of religion. A lot of these constitutions put religion front and center in their constitutional framework. Pakistan does that. Malaysia does that. A lot of countries do that. India does not do that. Second is this idea of a political party. Like, you'd be surprised by the number of constitutions that put a political party
Wow.
in the constitution itself. So for example, Algeria, again, the Front National is seen as the political party that runs Algeria, and the Front National will choose various members who will then there will be elections. So there is this idea of a political party. And then there are obviously some of the African republics which name particular people. Like Kenneth Kaunda is named in the constitution as the first premier of Zambia. I forget whether they call it president or prime minister, and henceforth there will be a presidential system. So you have these kind of interesting riffs of the way in which constitutions are traditionally formed. But the fundamental point in this wave of constitution making is that the constitutions typically of post-colonial states continue following the colonial language in large part. Okay. And how do we change that? I think change happens over time. If there is another constitutional moment, yes, sure, as in we can change that. But can we manufacture such a constitutional moment? I would say not. Right? There are examples where this has happened, like France, for example. France has had 5 republics, and each republic has had a new constitution. But I think society has to be ready for it, for something that is fundamentally different from what we had before. Where we are in India today, as in whether we like it or not, we are in phase 1 of some kind of decolonization. I see this as the unfinished business of partition, because I think a lot of this sentiment of decolonization was papered over because of Gandhi and the Congress party, which became kind of a big tent accommodating views rather than let various views have a field day. So I think some of these views are coming out into the open. And what passes off as decolonization, and this is true across the board, is in the first phase, it's symbols, right? You change roads and you change names and you stuff like that. I mean, there's nothing wrong in that. It's something that happens. We should just think that is what decolonization is. The second stage, and I think that we are seeing kind of the beginnings of that, is when we are actually changing laws. So the 3 criminal laws which have been changed, and these have been seen as changes to decolonize the IPC, the Criminal Procedure Code, which was not a colonial statute, and the Indian Evidence Act. Now, the impulse is fine. The impulse is that these were colonial statutes that were meant to essentially incarcerate Indians, and so we want to do away with that impulse. It's a fair impulse, because if you see the Evidence Act, the basis of the Evidence Act is that the natives can't be trusted. So we'll have all these elaborate rules of evidence to make sure that they are speaking the truth. But what have we done in these 3 laws? I think that we have essentially doubled down on what a colonial administrator would do. There are 11 provisions which had the death penalty in the IPC. We have created 15 provisions which have the death penalty in this new BNS. So my sense is that this is something that Macaulay would have felt proud of. Because Macaulay said that it will be the proudest day in English administration when a native government itself chooses English institutions and English modes of thought.
And we are doing that and calling it decolonization.
Yeah, and I think this is also a rite of passage. I think somewhere we feel, because of the impulse, that it is decolonization. But what we are doing, we are not even, because as Frantz Fanon said, colonialism is a total project, right? It's kind of seeped into your minds and heads, and all of ours as well. I mean, the very fact that we are having this, perhaps the only language we could have this conversation so fluently is English, is also perhaps a testament as to how total this is. And
I'll kind of disagree. English is an Indian language now. I would not call it colonial in any way.
Yeah, I mean, we Indianized it, and the point remains that we are calling it decolonization where it is actually not. And I think that's kind of the second phase, and I think we are in the second phase. And the purpose for writing this book was essentially that, can decolonization mean something that is genuinely meaningful? And for me, what would be truly decolonial is when you have a different dynamic between the state and the citizen. Now, that for me would be moving beyond colonial language and moving to a language that truly empowers a citizen as a citizen. Now, I don't think any government in independent India would want to do that, which is why I find all this talk about the constitution going, I actually find it politically quite silly, because the constitution, I mean, if I were advising the government on this issue, I would say that we should keep it because it actually suits governments very well. I mean, why would you want to change something
It
like
gives them
this?
so much power.
It gives us so much power, and the playbook is set. Why would you want to change that into something else unless you want more power? I mean, so the point is that the idea behind the book is essentially to see as to whether decolonization can mean something that changes this dynamic between the citizen and the state, and more importantly, by provoking people through both the title and the cover and by some of the contents of the book, hopefully make people have a view on the constitution. Whether they agree with me or not, I mean, that's irrelevant. But the point is, it's important that people have a view on it. Because the moment, as I said, coming back to what we discussed earlier, the moment it's a holy book of any kind, it means that it's kind of wisdom that is you have inherited and you're not going to think about it anymore. And that means that usually it's kind of a document that doesn't remain alive and relevant. And I want it to be alive and relevant and want it to keep changing and evolving with the time.
Wise words, and I think your book is an extremely important contribution to this discourse around the Constitution, and more power to you. And I'm really confident that in the long run it will be seen for what it is.
Yeah, I'm sure. No, I'm glad to hear that, because as has been said, because we read so much Gandhi in this, as first they will laugh at you and ridicule you, and then they will support you, and then they will join you and follow you. And I think that this is my version of a quote. I got that completely wrong, but you get the general drift of it. And I think the greatest example of that actually is Ambedkar, and you see the struggle that Ambedkar has in his lifetime, where he is seen as a bit part politician. He's not given the time of day by Gandhi and the Congress. He's seen as someone who has to be accommodated. Really not someone who in his lifetime gets his due as a real free-thinking intellectual. I mean, again, you may agree or disagree with his views, but I think there can be no two views about the fact that he is a genuine intellectual, and it comes across in his exchanges with Gandhi as well. Here is Ambedkar, a kind of angry, raging intellectual who's concerned about consistency and coherence, and Gandhi, who is essentially a crafty correspondent who's trying to ensure that he's not moving the needle too much, saying a little bit but yet not saying it. So you can see that in his exchanges. But Ambedkar is someone who doesn't get his due in his lifetime, but I think it's compensated more, and I mean more than he could have ever imagined, perhaps after his death. So I think time has its own way. Not that my book is anywhere close to anything that Ambedkar has ever written, but time has its own way of rewarding people and giving them their due. And I remain confident that we all will get our due.
A magnificent note to end on, but not without the customary last question I ask all my guests, which is for, me and my listeners, recommend books, films, music, which, mean a lot to you. You love them so much, you want to share them with the world.
Yeah, no, so there are several. And as far as books are concerned, I think it's extremely critical that we all read Hind Swaraj. And I think we read Hind Swaraj because it is a fantastic example of what Gandhian thought is about. You will disagree wholly with many bits, but this is what original thinking can look like. Side by side, we all need, I think what should be mandatory reading in our schools is Annihilation of Caste. As an upper caste Hindu, caste is an issue that in our schools we had no idea about. It is a reality that I certainly didn't know of. And I think Annihilation of Caste, which is a powerful account of how caste has played a role in not only the lives of Ambedkar, but lives of millions of our countrymen and women, is extremely critical. That's one. So these are two book suggestions on top of my head, just because we are having this discussion on these issues. As far as films are concerned, because we talked about Algeria, there is a fantastic film called Of Gods and Men. You may have seen this, about a group of Christian missionaries in Algeria during the revolution who secretly support the movement. I think it's a fantastic film about what resistance in the face of adversity can look like. This is one of my true favorites, and I think something that we all need to we all would do well to see. And given we started the note on the Bengali language and Bengali language films, I think a hidden gem from Satyajit Ray is Devi, which often hasn't got its due because it came at the same time as Jalsha Ghar. And Jalsha Ghar, of course, is a fantastic movie on the end of feudalism, which is well worth watching. But Devi, I think, speaks to the current moment as well, as of abiding themes of patriarchy, of the role of religion, particularly relevant in today's time. And I think this is something that I would recommend to everybody. As far as music, I mean, I'm basically a person who listens to anything and everything that I find. As far as Indian bands are concerned, I really like Advaita, and as far as in the neighborhood, if I were to do concentric circles and go outside, I'm a big fan. I grew up with Junoon, and big fan of what they've done, and which they continue to do in some shape or form, as in not Junoon itself, but with Coke Studio Pakistan, which I think is just the most fantastic thing that has ever happened in the world of music. And I really liked the AI remastered version of the new Beatles song. And I don't know whether you had a chance to you had a chance to hear it. This is actually interesting in terms of what AI can or cannot do. John Lennon had written and sung these words, but no one could extract that from the background music. But with the help of AI, it's not that AI has sung this song or has done anything, but with the help of AI, they've now been able to put together a version of this song, which has just come out late last year. And if you're a Beatles fan like I am, that's something that's well worth listening to.
One day you and I can have another conversation where neither of us needs to be present. So AI Zindabad. Quick question, do you think AI will completely transform law?
Quick answer, yes. Long answer is that it should transform law. It's already started transforming it in many ways. So, for example, due diligence, basic contractual checks, which a lot of folks at law firms do, should be, is being done and will be done better by AI-assisted tools. One, we already see several AI-assisted tools being used in judgment writing, and I think that this is going to continue. I'll stick my neck out and say that within 10 years, simple cases like motor accident claims tribunal, cases of accident compensation and so on, will fundamentally be decided by AI-based programs. Maybe a human judge will sign off on it, but ultimately it will be decided by AI-based programs. Maybe the last vestige of the humans will be the constitution and constitutional law. Maybe that's where we'll resist till we can AI coming in and making decisions for us. That's what I think will happen. But who knows? The world's an interesting place.
The world is indeed an interesting place. Thank you for making it more interesting for me today. This was a lovely conversation. I really enjoyed.
Thanks, Amit. As a lifelong listener of your show, it's a real pleasure and delight to be on it, and look forward to the seen and the unseen continuing for long into the future.
Thank you.
Thanks.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode, head on over to your nearest bookstore, online or offline, and pick up The Colonial Constitution by Arghya Sengupta. Also, check out the show notes, enter rabbit holes at will. You can follow Arghya on Twitter at Arghya_justify. You can follow me on Twitter at Amit Varma, AMITVARMA. You can browse past episodes of The Seen and the Unseen at seenunseen.in. Thank you for listening. Did you enjoy this episode of The Seen and the Unseen? If so, would you like to support the production of the show? You can go over to seenunseen.in/support and contribute any amount you like to keep this podcast alive and kicking. Thank you.